Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I grew up in what locals called the Alexander House, a magnificent Victorian mansion built in 1929. While most houses in our area were modest and practical, this one stood out with its ornate architecture and rich history. The house was originally built by Maxwell Alexander, a prominent textile manufacturer who had revolutionized the fabric industry in New England. The house itself was a masterpiece of Victorian craftsmanship, with its towering turrets, elaborate wooden trim, and countless architectural quirks that made it unique. There was an old laundry lift system that connected all 3 floors, a fascinating conservatory that stayed warm even in the harshest winters, and a network of servant passages that created a maze within the walls. We moved there when I was 6 years old. To understand what happened, you need to know the layout of the upper floor. The grand staircase was a masterpiece of wooden craftsmanship, wrapping around 3 walls in a graceful ascent. The top landing formed a perfect square, leading to various corridors. My sisters and my hallway branched off to the right, containing our bedrooms and a shared bathroom, while our parents' master suite lay at the end of the main corridor. The door to our hallway was peculiar. It never stayed properly closed unless locked, always creeping open as if someone had just passed through. The lock was only accessible from our side, which meant anyone in the main corridor couldn't access it. During the times I was home alone, I always made sure to lock that door. I was nearing graduation when the first incident occurred. My sister had left for college years before, and my parents were away for a weekend in Vermont, just a few hours' drive away. They trusted me at home alone since I was already 18 and responsible. No wild parties, no drinking, just occasionally having friends over to watch movies, or the soccer team coming by for a swim. That particular night, I was alone because of a soccer tournament the next morning. My bedroom door was positioned so that from my bed, I had a clear view of the entrance. That night, I woke up and saw something that would change my perception of reality forever. In my doorway stood a figure, a tall man wearing a perfectly tailored 3-piece suit from another era. His hair was neatly combed back, and he had a distinguished air about him. The strange thing was, he didn't seem threatening. He raised his hand in an old-fashioned greeting, his fingers moving in a deliberate, graceful manner, like someone from a different time. I closed my eyes, convinced I was dreaming. When I opened them again, he was gone. The truly bizarre thing was that I wasn't frightened. If anything, there was an overwhelming sense of calm in the room. The next morning, I went about my routine, unlocked the hallway door, went downstairs, and headed to my soccer game. I didn't mention it to anyone because who would believe me? It had to be a dream. The door had been locked all night, after all. 6 years later, my sister was getting married. Her friend Ellie came from out of state to be a bridesmaid. Since we had plenty of room, she stayed in my old bedroom while I took my sister's old room. The morning of the wedding, I drove Ellie and another bridesmaid to the venue, about an hour away. Halfway there, Ellie mentioned she hadn't slept well. Being a good host, I asked what was wrong. Her response made my blood run cold. "The gentleman in your room wouldn't leave," she said. "He just kept doing this strange wave. I nearly drove off the road." I asked her to explain, and she described exactly what I had seen years before: the tall man in the vintage suit, the distinctive wave. Every detail matched perfectly. She even mentioned his pocket watch chain glinting in the moonlight, a detail I had forgotten until she mentioned it. Later, I discovered that the figure matched old photographs of Maxwell Alexander, the original owner. My mother then revealed that she too had seen a shadow man moving between our hallway doors during her late night returns from the hospital. Unlike typical ghost stories, none of us ever felt threatened by his presence. I've seen him twice more since then, both times in my sister's old room. The last time he didn't wave. After my mother's revelations, I checked the time after each sighting, always between 3 and 4 in the morning. I named him Max, and whenever unexplainable things happened, like my books rearranging themselves on the shelves or the conservatory plants flourishing even in winter, I would just say, "Good evening, Max," acknowledging his presence. What still amazes me is how quickly my mindset shifted from complete skepticism to accepting that I shared my home with the echo of a man from another time. 2 weeks ago, my 6-year-old niece, Lily, stayed over. She had left her favorite stuffed rabbit at the house, and since I lived nearby, I offered to take her to retrieve it. While I was doing some quick chores, she went upstairs to my old room, which still contained some old costume jewelry and dress-up clothes she loved to play with. The next day, my sister called to ask who else had been at the house with us. Lily had told her about seeing a tall man in a fancy suit looking at the old photographs in the hallway. She said she'd said hello, but he was too busy studying the pictures to respond. When she came out of the room later, he was gone. I know I was alone in the house that day. No one could have come up or down those stairs without my knowledge. Lily had never heard our stories about Max, yet she described him perfectly. Sometimes I wonder if he's still watching over his house, making sure it's well taken care of, just as he did in life. In 2001, my youngest son Oliver was involved in a devastating accident. He was only 4 years old when the incident occurred, a moment that would forever change our lives. His injuries were catastrophic. He stopped breathing multiple times, and the medical team had to resuscitate him 3 times during those first critical hours. The neurologist pulled my wife and me aside, his face grave as he explained that Oliver's brain injuries were severe. "I need you to understand," he said quietly, "that surviving the night would be nothing short of miraculous." We were shattered, our world crumbling around us as we tried to process his words. They kept Oliver in a medically induced coma to manage his brain pressure. The steady beeping of machines became our constant companion as we maintained our vigil by his bedside. Against all odds, he made it through that first night. A week later, when they finally reduced his medication, he opened his eyes. After they removed his breathing tubes, Oliver began speaking, but what he said left us puzzled. He kept asking about Isabella. I checked with the nursing staff, wondering if one of them shared that name, but none did. When I asked Oliver about her, his description was surprisingly detailed. She's an old lady who talks funny, he said matter-of-factly. I asked if she wore a nurse's uniform, but he shook his head. No, she always wears the same pretty dress, white with purple flowers. When I asked what she said to him, he told me she would tell him she loved him and that everything would be all right. Later that day, my father-in-law arrived at the hospital. When I mentioned Oliver's mysterious visitor, the color drained from his face. I know exactly who he's seeing, he said, his voice trembling. It's my mother, Isabella. She came from Sicily, had a thick accent her whole life, and she was buried in her favorite dress, white with purple flowers. We then learned something that sent chills down our spines. Our son's full name was Oliver Thomas, and we discovered from my father-in-law's older sister that they had had a brother named Oliver Thomas who died in Sicily at the age of 4. My father-in-law was the only child born after the family immigrated to America. If someone had told me this story, I might have dismissed it as a grieving family's imagination. But I witnessed it firsthand. I saw how Oliver's great-grandmother reached across the boundary between life and death to comfort her namesake. I believe she intervened to ensure that history wouldn't repeat itself, that our Oliver wouldn't share the fate of the uncle he never knew. Pure love, I've come to understand, transcends all boundaries, even those between life and death. Today, Oliver is 21. While he still deals with some challenges from the brain injury, he's grown into an intelligent young man. He continues to live with us, and ever since he returned from the hospital all those years ago, we've experienced numerous otherworldly events in our home. Sometimes I wonder if his brief encounters with death opened a door to something beyond our understanding. His near-death experience seems to have made him more sensitive to the supernatural world. But those are stories for another time. My family's story begins at Oakwood Heights Military Base, in a magnificent Queen Anne-style house, designated as Residence 42A. In the summer of 2006, we moved into this architectural masterpiece that stood at the end of a maple-lined crescent. The house, built in the early 1900s, was a testament to military elegance, with its grand architecture and mysterious past. The basement remained unfinished, illuminated only by antiquated pole lights that cast limited circles of visibility in the darkness. Most intriguing were the tiny footprints eternally preserved in the concrete floor, seemingly belonging to a child from long ago. The house's most striking feature was its dual staircase system. The main stairs, a magnificent centerpiece ascending from the ground to the second floor, and the servants' staircase, a narrow, winding passage that connected all 4 levels. The ground floor housed the main living areas, while my brother and I claimed the second floor. I chose the former master bedroom, complete with its own vintage doorbell system, a detail that delighted my 8-year-old self. My parents settled on the top floor, which included access to an unfinished attic space, still housing pieces of original furniture. Our babysitter once joked that the attic seemed like the perfect hideout for Victorian ghosts. About a month after settling in, we received an unexpected visitor. A woman from the local historical society knocked on our door, inquiring if we'd permit our home to be featured in their annual Halloween ghost tour. She explained that our residence was famous for its resident spirit, known as the Velvet Ghost, named for the distinctive velvet coat he was often seen wearing. When we mentioned being new residents, she asked about our length of stay. My father replied, "About a month." Her response was unsettling. "Strange, he usually introduces himself by now." My father politely declined participation in the tour. We were still unpacking boxes stored in the garage, which connected to the back stairwell near the basement. That's when my father noticed the garage light had burnt out. A simple maintenance task turned bizarre when the light flickered back to life as he reached for it. After ensuring the bulb was secure, he descended the ladder, only to have the light die again. This pattern repeated several times, the light extinguishing when he moved away, illuminating when he approached with the ladder. Frustrated, my father finally exclaimed, "Stop messing around." To everyone's amazement, the light stabilized and remained consistently lit throughout our entire residency. This marked our first encounter with what would become 10 months of inexplicable events. Other occurrences followed. The radio would suddenly tune to static at full volume, and certain basement rooms remained strictly off-limits to our normally adventurous dog. We began attributing these incidents to the Velvet Man's antics. During our stay, we discovered more about the house's haunted history through a local book of ghost stories. One tale particularly caught our attention: the story of a young girl who had befriended a spirit, spending hours playing with dolls together. When her family moved away, she left her favorite doll behind as a gift for her supernatural friend. Remarkably, we found what appeared to be that very doll hidden in a drawer among the attic's original furniture. The most chilling experience occurred when my father, a night pilot, stayed in the house alone. While sleeping during the day, he was awakened by heavy footsteps ascending the main staircase. Upon investigation, he found nothing. The footsteps later resumed on the second floor, followed by the sound of furniture moving in the attic room. My father, a practical man not given to flights of fancy, left the house immediately. For years, we've shared these experiences with friends and family. We've continued researching online, discovering others who encountered the same friendly but mischievous spirit in that house. The Velvet Ghost, as he became known, seemed to have left an indelible mark on everyone who lived there. Recently, I was visiting my parents with my skeptical boyfriend. As my father recounted these stories, the kitchen light began flickering. Half-jokingly, my boyfriend called out, "Stop messing around." Just like years before, the light immediately stabilized and remained steady throughout our visit. Don't take my word for it, research residence 42A at Oakwood Heights Base. There are countless stories from this historic military installation that deserve to be heard, including ours. And if you happen to live in that house now, please keep the Velvet Ghost's story alive on the Halloween tour. Last night, I stayed at my boyfriend's house in his basement bedroom. The room was tucked away in a corner of the house, surrounded by thick concrete walls that kept it perpetually cool and quiet. Usually, these conditions made it perfect for sleeping, like being wrapped in a cocoon of silence. Around 4 in the morning, I woke up suddenly, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I was lying on my side, facing my boyfriend as he slept peacefully. The soft sound of his breathing was the only noise in the room. I remained still for about 30 or 40 seconds, studying his face in the dim light and trying to understand what had pulled me from sleep. Then it happened. An unsettling sensation crept over me, like cold water trickling down my spine. There was this overwhelming feeling, an instinct really, that I needed to turn around. I tried to ignore it at first, but the urge grew stronger with each passing second, becoming almost impossible to resist. Fighting against my better judgment, I slowly began to roll over. As I turned onto my other side, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart skip several beats. There was someone standing by the door. My first rational thought was that it must be his mother. The figure had a similar height and build, just standing there motionless near the doorway. But even as this thought formed, my mind snagged on an obvious question. Why would his mother be in the basement at this hour? I had only a fraction of a second to process this thought before the figure began moving. It started gliding toward the bed, and that's when the reality hit me like a physical blow. This was definitely not his mother. I couldn't make out any distinct features in the darkness, but something about the way it moved felt fundamentally wrong, as if it wasn't quite following the natural laws of motion. A gasp of pure terror escaped my throat, the sound sharp and involuntary in the quiet room. My boyfriend jolted awake instantly, startled by my sudden outburst. In that same moment, the figure darted toward the corner of the room with impossible speed, as if it were being pulled by an invisible force. 1 second it was there, moving toward us, and the next it had simply vanished. I couldn't find my voice to tell him what I'd seen. The words seemed stuck in my throat, and honestly, I didn't want to sound crazy. But I was wide awake now, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. This wasn't a dream or a trick of the light. I had been completely conscious and aware of my surroundings. Now, hours later, I can't stop replaying the incident in my mind. The memory feels burnt into my consciousness. The way the figure stood so still at first, how it moved with that unnatural grace, and its impossible disappearance. But what disturbs me most are the unanswered questions. Who or what was that presence in the basement? And why did I feel so strongly compelled to turn around in the first place, as if something wanted me to see it? I'm still unsettled, and every time I close my eyes, I see that dark figure standing by the door. The rational part of my mind tries to explain it away, but deep down, I know what I saw was real something that shouldn't exist in our ordinary world, yet chose to reveal itself to me in those early morning hours. I lived in a modest apartment on the 3rd floor of an aging building. Its walls painted a soft cream color that seemed to stretch endlessly. While it wasn't luxurious, it provided plenty of space for me and my small menagerie: 2 cats, Luna and Pixel, and 3 friendly dogs. Though the apartment lacked a balcony, the spacious living room gave my pets plenty of room to roam and play. It was a peaceful place, free from the typical haunted house cliches. No flickering lights or mysterious creaks, just the gentle hum of an old building settling into itself. Everything felt completely normal, until one particularly unsettling afternoon that changed everything. That day after lunch, golden sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across the cream-colored walls. Luna and Pixel had claimed their usual afternoon spots on my bed, basking in the tranquil atmosphere. I was in the living room, enjoying a cup of coffee and reading, when a sound shattered the peaceful scene, a deep, guttural growl from Luna. I recognized her growl immediately, which was unusual because she was typically the gentler of my two cats. Rushing to the bedroom, I found both cats fully alert, their fur standing on end, and their eyes wide with unmistakable fear. Luna stood rigid, hissing at something in the corner of the room, while Pixel, usually the more daring of the pair, was beside her, growling fiercely. Following their gaze, I saw nothing, just the bare cream walls and the shadow of my reading chair in the corner. But the cats were absolutely terrified, continuing to hiss and growl at whatever they perceived in that empty corner. They remained frozen in their defensive postures, as if facing an invisible intruder. I called their names softly, trying to calm them, but they remained transfixed. Then, without warning, both cats bolted from the room, racing down the hallway into the living room where they took refuge behind the couch. Despite my attempts to coax them out with treats and gentle words, they refused to return to the bedroom for the rest of the day. I spent the afternoon pondering what could have triggered such an extreme reaction. Cats can be sensitive to various things: changes in air pressure, distant sounds, even electromagnetic fields. But this response seemed too intense, too genuine to be explained away so easily. I thoroughly inspected the room, checking for drafts, pests in the walls, anything that might explain their behavior. But I found nothing out of the ordinary. For the next few days, Luna and Pixel completely avoided the bedroom. They would slink past the doorway with wide, cautious eyes, preferring to stay in the living room or hallway. It was as if the bedroom contained something they wanted no part of. I started to accept the possibility that perhaps they had sensed something beyond my understanding. Then, just as suddenly as it began, their fear seemed to fade. Gradually, they started venturing back into the bedroom, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence, until life appeared to return to normal. I had nearly forgotten about the strange incident until a few weeks later. I was cleaning the bedroom when I noticed something odd on the wall near the corner where the cats had focused their attention that day. There was a small patch of something sticky, almost like adhesive, though I had no idea how it got there. When I touched it, it felt strange, slightly cold and tacky, but not quite like any substance I'd encountered before. I cleaned it off without much thought, but a few days later, it reappeared, the same sticky substance in exactly the same spot. I cleaned it again, puzzled but not yet alarmed. When it appeared a third time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I remembered a documentary about paranormal phenomena where they mentioned ectoplasm, a substance supposedly left behind by spirits. While I'd always been skeptical of such things, the idea lingered in my mind. Could this be connected to what the cats had seen, or thought they had seen that day? They had acted as if they were staring directly at something in that very corner, and now this inexplicable substance kept manifesting itself, as if trying to make its presence known. I found myself wondering about the apartment's history, about who might have lived or died there before me. The building was old, and who knew what stories these walls held? Eventually, the mysterious substance stopped appearing, and the cats returned to their usual carefree behavior. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that afternoon. The cats' absolute terror in the face of something I couldn't perceive. I'd never believed in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, But this experience made me question my assumptions. Was there something more in that room that day? Something that only my cats could see? Sometimes I wonder if they protected me from something I wasn't meant to witness. Our farmhouse has been a hotbed of paranormal activity for as long as I can remember. It's an old homestead that's been passed down through 4 generations of my family, and the property has witnessed its fair share of history. Built around 1880, the house doesn't have a particularly violent past, but it certainly has its stories to tell. My grandmother passed away in what later became my nursery. My great-grandfather met his fate falling from the hay loft back in the 1920s. There's even an unmarked grave from the Civil War era that was discovered during some construction work in the 1970s. Supernatural occurrences are so common here that they've become part of our daily life. Books dance across shelves. Cabinet doors swing open and shut of their own accord, and objects mysteriously relocate themselves. We often hear footsteps echoing through empty hallways when no one else is home. Shadowy figures appear in doorways, and sometimes voices drift from the old grain silos, which is particularly unsettling since anyone actually inside would quickly suffocate in the grain. None of these manifestations ever felt malicious, so we've learned to take it all in stride. In fact, we've become so accustomed to the supernatural that I completely ignored what turned out to be a very real intruder trying to break into our back door last night. I was in my brother's room, tinkering with his computer, when I heard odd knocking sounds from outside. Knocking was nothing new. We heard it all the time, though usually from inside the house, so I simply ignored it. This continued for about 3 to 4 minutes, until my dog started growling with unusual intensity. This caught my attention because he typically only growled at the basement door. Concerned, I went to calm him in the living room. That's when I heard the back door in the kitchen rattling. Without thinking twice, I called out, "Stop it, you're going to break the handle." The kind of thing we routinely said when our spiritual residents got particularly rowdy. Perhaps 30 seconds later, I heard the door swing open. Still thinking it was just another ghostly visitor, I casually yelled, "Pretty sure I told you to knock it off." I didn't realize anything was amiss until an unfamiliar voice muttered, "Shoot," and the door slammed shut. Finally grasping the situation, I ran to investigate, arriving just in time to see a blue pickup truck speeding away from our driveway. The realization hit me. I had mistaken a real break-in attempt for our usual paranormal activity. So here's a word of caution to anyone living in a haunted house. Don't get too comfortable with your supernatural housemates. The next time you hear something go bump in the night, it might not be who or what you think it is. Paranormal experiences have been woven into the fabric of my family's existence for as long as I can remember. From mysterious figures appearing in windows to objects flying off counters, these unexplainable events seem to follow us wherever we go, like persistent shadows of another world. Our first encounters happened in the Victorian house, where I spent my early years. I refused to sleep in my bedroom, and my family often commented on how the upstairs always felt heavy with an unseen presence. The converted attic room, which wasn't part of the original structure, carried a particularly oppressive atmosphere. We constantly felt watched there. Once we even captured a photograph showing a distinct face peering through one of the windows. And we moved to our next home, hoping to leave the strange occurrences behind. They followed us like unwanted luggage. Windows would mysteriously shatter. Cups continued their airborne adventures off countertops, and doors would slam shut with tremendous force. These incidents typically occurred when someone was alone, or in that vulnerable state between sleep and wakefulness. My mother once woke to the sensation of being slapped while sleeping. In our next residence, the activity intensified. Security cameras captured unexplainable orbs of light floating through rooms. I started experiencing more direct encounters myself. One afternoon, my leather-bound prayer book suddenly launched itself from its shelf, landing with a heavy thud on the floor. Another time, I witnessed a dark shadow move across our shower window, leaving me deeply unsettled. My sister later told me about finding my silver crucifix thrown across my room, landing face down. The house's electrical system began behaving erratically. Doors would violently shake, and family members increasingly reported being scratched or slapped by invisible forces. One particularly memorable incident occurred when I was around 4 years old. My mother and I were in the same room when we heard 3 distinct, thunderous bangs outside. Upon investigation, we found nothing there, and oddly, our motion-activated security lights hadn't triggered. In that same house, while it was still under construction, my parents heard the unmistakable sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the floor upstairs. Even though the house was completely empty, waiting for our furniture to arrive. Another unsettling event occurred when my sister was an infant. My parents couldn't see her on the baby monitor's screen, but when they rushed to check, she was safely in her crib, exactly where they'd left her. In our current home, the supernatural activity has escalated to new levels. We regularly experience doors shaking violently, see shadows moving outside windows, and hear the back door opening when the house is empty. I've been scratched multiple times, each incident leaving me increasingly uneasy. Recently, one of the more striking incidents occurred when I left my room to prepare some food. On my shelf sat my prayer book, which had never moved on its own before. Upon returning, I found it sprawled across the room, lying open but not to any particular page. On another occasion, my sister reported seeing my crucifix thrown across the room again, landing face down just as before. There's also a persistent feeling of unease when standing in darkened rooms. My mother has witnessed door handles rattling inexplicably, and we've heard mysterious knocking on windows at night. While some of the electrical disturbances might have logical explanations, many events defy rational understanding. Last month, a friend staying over to watch our dog reported feeling someone firmly push against their shoulder while they slept. They were alone in the house, and our dog was in another room entirely. I thought the activity had finally subsided after a priest blessed the house about a year ago. But recently, things have started up again. One night, while lying in bed, I felt a burning sensation on my neck. Looking in the mirror, I discovered angry red marks, 4 distinct scratches, with 2 of them merging into one. We've also heard our names being called out when no one else is home, and the feeling of being watched has become more intense. A family member even woke up to see a face staring at them through their bedroom door window. These experiences span from 2014 to 2024, with periods of calm punctuated by bursts of intense activity. Some months pass without incident, but then the supernatural events return with renewed vigor, as if whatever haunts us is merely taking breaks between performances. My mother had developed a severe sinus infection and needed to take her medication precisely on schedule to manage the excruciating pain. She set an alarm for somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning to ensure she wouldn't miss her dose. That evening, we were lounging in the front room, watching old movies together, trying to pass the time until her next round of medication. Eventually, we both drifted off to sleep, the television still softly playing in the background. The house was peaceful, wrapped in that peculiar stillness that only exists in the early morning hours. But this tranquility was about to be shattered in the most terrifying way. Before her alarm could even sound, we were jolted awake by a series of violent crashes. The noise was devastating, not just one or two bangs, but a cacophony of sounds that seemed to shake the entire house. We bolted upright on the couch, our hearts pounding in our chests. For a moment, we were convinced someone had broken into the house. The darkness felt oppressive as we sat there, frozen in fear. We were certain that whoever had entered didn't realize we were home. The thunderous noise was coming from the kitchen, sounding like someone was systematically destroying everything in sight. My pulse was racing as we cautiously made our way toward the source of the chaos. When we stepped into the kitchen, we stopped dead in our tracks. Every single cabinet door, drawer, and appliance door stood wide open. The refrigerator, the stove, the washing machine, the dryer, even the basement and bathroom doors. Some of the cabinet doors were still swaying slightly, as if they had been violently thrown open just seconds before. The atmosphere in the kitchen felt wrong, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the air itself had become thick and heavy, with an unseen presence. We quickly checked on everyone else in the house. My father and my 3 brothers were all sound asleep, completely undisturbed by the supernatural chaos that had erupted downstairs. We methodically checked every door and window in the house. Everything was locked tight, with no signs of forced entry. There was absolutely no logical explanation for what had just occurred. To this day, I have no rational way to explain what happened that night. It wasn't a dream. Both my mother and I witnessed exactly the same thing. It wasn't our imagination playing tricks on us. The physical evidence of every door standing open was undeniable. Something or someone had made their presence known in our home that night, and the memory of it still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. The incident left an indelible mark on our family's history. While we never experienced anything quite so dramatic again, that night served as a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Sometimes the boundary between our ordinary reality and something else becomes unexpectedly thin. And what lies beyond that boundary can reach through in ways we can't begin to understand. My friend has been experiencing increasingly disturbing paranormal activity in her home for several years now. It started subtly small occurrences that could easily be dismissed as forgetfulness or imagination. Maybe you'd think you closed a drawer or turned off a light, only to find it open or illuminated later. But recently, the activity has intensified significantly. I advised her early on to ignore it, to not acknowledge or engage with whatever was causing these disturbances. The entity seems particularly active in her bedroom closet, where it regularly knocks on the door. She's captured the sounds on video several times, but always leaves abruptly afterward, unsettled by what she's recorded. The presence has developed a pattern of manipulating electronic devices, turning on lights, activating fans, and mysteriously triggering the printer. While it had generally avoided direct interaction with her 7-year-old daughter, that recently changed. One day, while both mother and daughter were in the room, the knocking started on the closet door. Naturally, her daughter was curious, but my friend simply said, "It's nothing," and quickly took her downstairs. Yesterday, things escalated further. Her daughter was upstairs calling out, asking where her mother was. When my friend responded that she was downstairs, her daughter said she could hear someone walking around up there. Then last night, while they were sleeping, her daughter came running into her mother's room, terrified by something happening in her own room. My friend simply invited her daughter to sleep in her bed, saying they would investigate in the morning. When they checked the next day, they found her mirror shattered and a glass decoration she treasured completely broken. I'm not an expert in paranormal matters, but I can't help feeling that my friend's strategy of ignoring the entity is only making it more aggressive. It seems to have shifted its attention to her daughter, who is clearly reacting to its presence. What makes this situation even more concerning is my friend's health. She suffers from fibromyalgia, and since this entity first appeared, her condition has deteriorated significantly. It's been one health crisis after another. While it might sound far-fetched, I can't help wondering if there's a connection between these supernatural occurrences and her declining health. I witnessed something strange myself when visiting her house before a trip we planned to Portland, Oregon. I spent the night at her place since we had an early morning flight. We were sitting in her family room chatting when I noticed something in my peripheral vision. A dark figure walked from what appeared to be the stairway area into her front living room. I initially dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. About 10 minutes later, it happened again, the same dark figure, but this time moving back toward the stairway. I didn't mention what I'd seen until we were heading to the airport the next morning. While in Portland, we spoke to her daughter, who was 9 at the time. My friend casually asked how she was doing, and her daughter's response sent chills down our spines. "I'm okay," she said, "but I keep seeing the really tall shadow person with the long fingers." We exchanged knowing looks and tried to brush it off as a dream, but we both knew it wasn't. Her daughter had described exactly what I had witnessed the night before, without any prior knowledge of my experience. The situation continues to worsen, and I'm increasingly concerned about both my friend and her daughter. There must be a way to address this that won't antagonize whatever has taken up residence in their home. But what's the right approach when ignoring it clearly isn't working anymore? I work in a centuries-old building that once served as a medical facility during the Victorian era. Its reputation for being haunted is well documented, complete with a particularly eerie room in the basement where bodies were stored during winter months until the ground thawed enough for burial. One evening, while working late, I experienced something that would forever change my perspective on the supernatural. I was alone in the building. The security system was armed, and I had been the only one to enter since closing. As I worked at my desk, I heard it, a woman's voice, clear as day, humming a haunting melody from somewhere in the basement. The sound was unmistakable, floating up through the old air vents and empty corridors. There was absolutely no possibility of another person being in the building. I had personally checked all entrances and exits when I arrived. I called my friend, a skeptic who had always dismissed my concerns about the building's supernatural reputation. Intrigued by the urgency in my voice, she came to witness it herself. After about 30 minutes of waiting, the humming began again. The melody was old-fashioned, like a lullaby from another century. But there was something unsettling about its clarity and persistence. We both stood there, frozen in fear, before finally running out of the building. Since then, I've never worked alone there after sunset, unless other people were present in the building. That incident occurred years ago, but I can still recall the tune perfectly. It haunts my memories. Sometimes I find myself wondering about the source of that voice. Was it truly the spirit of a woman from the building's medical past, or something more sinister masquerading as something familiar, trying to lure us down into the basement? A few weeks before the humming incident, I experienced something even more terrifying. While working at my computer, I noticed a tall shadow entering through the doorway to my left. As I turned my head quickly to look, the shadow passed directly through me. The sensation was like being struck by lightning, a violent electrical charge that sent shockwaves through my body. There was a loud crack from my neck, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, everything was hazy and spinning. I went home, but the symptoms persisted and grew worse, developing into serious neurological issues. Medical examinations revealed that the vertebrae in my neck had actually fractured. The joint securing my head to my neck had snapped. Today, my neck is reinforced with titanium rods and numerous screws. I tell everyone it happened because I turned my head too quickly, explaining that I have a condition that makes my joints and ligaments particularly fragile. While this is true, I've never shared the full story of what I saw that day. Months later, I overheard a colleague describing to someone how he had witnessed a tall shadow enter the room and walk straight across, passing through the opposite wall. He had been sitting across from where I was when my injury occurred, meaning I had been directly in the path of whatever had walked through the room that day. I finally told him about my experience, and we discussed the possibility that it might have been the spirit of a doctor still making his rounds, unaware that his time had long since passed. It sounds incredible, which is why I've only shared this story with my partner. While I have X-rays and surgical scars to prove my injury, I have no way to prove what actually caused it. I still work for the same company, but since that month, I've arranged to work remotely. I only visit the building for meetings, and even then, only when it's crowded with other people. The experience has left me with more than just physical scars. It's forever changed my understanding of what might exist in the spaces we think we know so well. It all began in 2016, when I moved into an apartment in Riverside Heights with my daughter Ruby, who was just 2 years old at the time. A few months after settling in, I overheard her talking in her room. Curious, I went to investigate and asked who she was speaking to. She pointed to her bed and said matter-of-factly, "It's Tommy. He's sitting right there." I felt a chill run down my spine, but tried to dismiss it, walking away to process what I just heard. A few days later, while visiting my mother, I noticed Ruby playing on a small slide. She suddenly waved her hand, as if saying no to thin air. Concerned, she ran over to me and mentioned Tommy, but didn't elaborate. That night, I decided to ask her more about Tommy. She told me he was 4 years old and had owies. When I pressed for more details, she looked beside her and said, "He's sick. He has tubes in his arms." Then she quickly ran off, leaving me deeply unsettled. One night I heard her crying softly, saying, "Tommy, don't sing that song, it scares me." She woke up screaming, claiming that Tommy was crawling on the wall and frightening her. The next morning, as I headed to the laundry room, I saw a dark shadow figure wearing what appeared to be a vintage newsboy cap. I had reached my limit. My downstairs neighbor, who practiced traditional indigenous medicine, kindly offered to cleanse my apartment. After that, things quieted down for a while. In 2020, I moved to another apartment just up the street. A few months after moving in, Ruby discovered the bathroom with its old 3-panel mirror. She could open the side mirrors and would talk to the reflection in the middle one. When I asked what she was doing, she replied simply, "Talking to my friends in the mirror." Initially, I didn't think much of it, but she began spending more time there. One day, I overheard her say, "I can't wait for you to meet my baby sister when she comes. I will show her to you." At that point, I was pregnant with her sister Willow. After hearing that, I decided she was no longer allowed to play in the bathroom. About a year later, I moved to a better place in Riverside Manor. And after 3 years of living there, the strange occurrences began once more. One day, my children and I heard a woman singing "Rockabye Baby." It became unsettling when she started whispering it directly into my child's ear. It felt like something was mimicking us. One day, I distinctly heard Ruby screaming. I instinctively responded, only to remember she was at a friend's house. One night, while sitting in my living room, my dog began to stare intently at the mirror. It was odd. He didn't even seem to be looking at his own reflection. I often wonder what's happening here. Why do these paranormal experiences follow us from home to home? Is there a way to finally be free of these supernatural encounters? The incidents have left me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality and the invisible world that seems to exist alongside our own. I work in a centuries-old building that once served as a medical facility during the Victorian era. Its reputation for being haunted is well documented, complete with a particularly eerie room in the basement where bodies were stored during winter months, until the ground thawed enough for burial. One evening, while working late, I experienced something that would forever change my perspective on the supernatural. I was alone in the building. The security system was armed, and I had been the only one to enter since closing. As I worked at my desk, I heard it, a woman's voice, clear as day, humming a haunting melody from somewhere in the basement. The sound was unmistakable, floating up through the old air vents and empty corridors. There was absolutely no possibility of another person being in the building. I had personally checked all entrances and exits when I arrived. I called my friend, a skeptic who had always dismissed my concerns about the building's supernatural reputation. Intrigued by the urgency in my voice, she came to witness it herself. After about 30 minutes of waiting, the humming began again. The melody was old-fashioned, like a lullaby from another century. But there was something unsettling about its clarity and persistence. We both stood there, frozen in fear, before finally running out of the building. Since then, I've never worked alone there after sunset, unless other people were present in the building. That incident occurred years ago, but I can still recall the tune perfectly. It haunts my memories. Sometimes I find myself wondering about the source of that voice. Was it truly the spirit of a woman from the building's medical past, or something more sinister masquerading as something familiar, trying to lure us down into the basement? A few weeks before the humming incident, I experienced something even more terrifying. While working at my computer, I noticed a tall shadow entering through the doorway to my left. As I turned my head quickly to look, the shadow passed directly through me. The sensation was like being struck by lightning, a violent electrical charge that sent shockwaves through my body. There was a loud crack from my neck, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, everything was hazy and spinning. I went home, but the symptoms persisted and grew worse, developing into serious neurological issues. Medical examinations revealed that the vertebrae in my neck had actually fractured. The joint securing my head to my neck had snapped. Today, my neck is reinforced with titanium rods and numerous screws. I tell everyone it happened because I turned my head too quickly, explaining that I have a condition that makes my joints and ligaments particularly fragile. While this is true, I've never shared the full story of what I saw that day. Months later, I overheard a colleague describing to someone how he had witnessed a tall shadow enter the room and walk straight across, passing through the opposite wall. He had been sitting across from where I was when my injury occurred, meaning I had been directly in the path of whatever had walked through the room that day. I finally told him about my experience, and we discussed the possibility that it might have been the spirit of a doctor still making his rounds, unaware that his time had long since passed. It sounds incredible, which is why I've only shared this story with my partner. While I have X-rays and surgical scars to prove my injury, I have no way to prove what actually caused it. I still work for the same company, but since that month, I've arranged to work remotely. I only visit the building for meetings, and even then, only when it's crowded with other people. The experience has left me with more than just physical scars. It's forever changed my understanding of what might exist in the spaces we think we know so well. I'd like to share something that happened exactly 6 months ago today. My mother passed away unexpectedly, just 2 weeks after my daughter was born. She had always been deeply suspicious of modern technology and was a lifelong smoker of hand-rolled cigarettes. The haunting began shortly after her extended wake and burial. It started with small things, like the wooden spoon flying out of the pancake bowl every time my son and I made breakfast. We tried to brush it off, assuming it was just her way of saying hello from the other side. Then, about a week later, something more specific occurred. I was home alone except for the baby, our old retriever, and the cat. When my husband and son arrived home, we all went to the nursery together. As I prepared to lay the baby on the changing table, I noticed what looked like a long piece of dust, the kind that falls from ceiling fans. But as I leaned closer to brush it away, I realized it was cigarette ash, the distinctive kind that comes from hand-rolled cigarettes. With that telltale length that forms when someone waits too long to tap it off. What really sent shivers down our spines was the location. The changing table sat exactly where my mother's bed had been when my parents first moved into this house. We often joked that in some parallel universe, she was still alive, sitting in her bed, rolling her cigarettes and watching over us all. However, starting in the middle of last night and continuing into today, something new began happening. My smart speakers, both the voice hub and the home assistant, kept randomly announcing the light is off. When I first heard it, I thought maybe my son or husband was silencing an alarm and the device had misheard them. But today, with just the sleeping baby and me in a completely silent kitchen, it's still randomly happening. I checked the activity logs on both devices, but there were no recorded commands or triggers. I wanted to share this story because I find comfort in these experiences, especially when I'm missing my mom. She was such an enthusiast of paranormal stories, and my sisters and I always said that if she were to try communicating from the other side, it would be through playful pranks and by messing with electronic devices. The very things she distrusted in life. The fact that she might be using modern technology to reach out to us now feels like one final joke from her. A mother's love finding its way through the very devices she once avoided. I'm grateful that in some ways, my mother's presence still lingers, reminding us that love truly does transcend all boundaries, even the one between life and death. As I sit here listening to the occasional, unexplained announcements from my smart speakers, I can almost picture her laughing, finally mastering technology in ways she never did in life, just to let us know she's still watching over her new granddaughter and all of us. Some might find it unsettling, but to me, it's a precious reminder that she's still part of our family story, still finding ways to make her presence known in her own unique style. The scariest moment of my life happened in 2019 when I was 15. My best friend Emma, also 15, was over at my house, and we were hanging out with my two younger sisters, 12-year-old Lily and 8-year-old Sophie, in the living room. We got up to go to the front door, which required passing our house's main hallway, a corridor that connected all 6 bedrooms. As we passed the hallway, we all froze in our tracks. There, before our eyes, was a woman in an antique lace dress, leading a little girl who looked exactly like my younger sister by the hand. We watched in stunned silence as they walked from one room into another. After the initial shock wore off, we started discussing what we'd seen. Strangely, only Emma and I had seen the little girl. My sisters had only noticed the woman in the lace dress. After a few hours, we tried to put the incident behind us. Such occurrences were surprisingly common in our house, though we never understood why. Later that night, we split up. My younger sisters went to their room, which was just 2 steps across the hall from mine, while Emma and I stayed in the living room. Like typical teenagers, we decided to experiment with some forbidden herbs using a makeshift pipe. About 2 puffs in, I heard my younger sister running down the hallway. Emma quickly hid everything under my blanket as I got up. My sister was pounding on my door, desperately begging me to let her in. Worried about the herbal smell, I fought to keep the door closed while she screamed at the top of her lungs, "They're coming! They're coming! They're coming!" "Help me," I tried, talking to her through the door, saying I'd be there in less than a minute. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 60 seconds, the banging suddenly stopped. Emma and I looked at each other, terrified that my parents had woken up and would smell the herbs. I counted to 10 before crossing the hall to check on my sister. When I entered her room, I found her sound asleep in her loft bed. Lily was there and looked confused when I asked what our sister had wanted. "What do you mean?" she asked. I pointed to our sleeping sister, and Lily said, "What are you talking about?" "She's been asleep for like 15 minutes. I just got out of bed and was heading to my room." At this point, I felt like I was being pranked. I went to check on my younger sister, who couldn't keep a straight face to save her life, but she was genuinely fast asleep. Her pulse was calm, and there was no way she could have been the one banging on the door, climbing her steps, and then pretending to fall asleep while slowing her heart rate in the minute that had passed. I brought Lily to my room and sat down with Emma. I explained that my sister had been asleep the whole time, and Emma immediately teared up in fear. Then I explained to Lily about the banging on the door and the screaming about something coming to get her. Lily insisted there was no way. They'd been together the entire time. My family definitely has at least one entity attached to us, and it regularly reveals itself to us and other family members. Usually, it's just glimpses from the corner of our eyes or a shadow standing in a closet corner. But there was something bone-chilling about this experience. To have someone not related to us experience it, to struggle against this thing as it used my sister's voice to plead for entry. What would have happened if we weren't strong enough to keep the door closed? What was its ultimate goal? Since that night, I've seen it appear as my younger sister several times, walking through doorways, reflected in windows while I'm doing dishes. It's terrifying, but we've mostly learned to live with it. Whatever it is, it seems content to merely mimic and observe, though I still wonder about its true nature and intentions. I'm a bus driver in a small town in Yorkshire, England. 2 nights ago, I think I picked up a passenger's soul on my route. I've worked with this bus company for 8.5 years, driving the same route for the past 3 years. Over this time, I've gotten to know my regulars, the faces I see multiple times a day, taking them to work, to shops, or to their evening activities. I often step out to help elderly passengers with their shopping bags and such. One of my regular passengers was an elderly lady named Margaret. I'd been driving her for the entire 3 years I'd worked this route. She suffered from dementia, but managed well for the first 2.5 years. Sometimes she'd get a bit confused, but I was always patient and helped however I could. I'd pick her up from the stop right outside her house, just a 10-second walk from her door, and take her to the local community center where she and her friends played bingo. However, her dementia worsened significantly in the last 6 months. After an incident on my bus where she became very confused and distressed. I had to stop and try to calm her down. Fortunately, another passenger knew her son, who worked nearby and came to help. My manager understood completely and approved my decision to ask other passengers to catch the next bus while I stayed with Margaret. Her son arrived, calmed her down, and got her home safely. We talked about Margaret, and I explained how we'd become friendly over the years. He said she often spoke fondly of me and explained that her condition had deteriorated rapidly. He took my number, insisting on arranging a thank you gift despite my protests. I never saw Margaret again after that day, but I did see her son at the shops. He explained that she had gotten worse, and it wasn't safe for her to leave the house anymore. I thanked him for letting me know and asked to be kept updated on her condition, as we'd become friends over the years. This brings us to last night. I was covering the late shift when, around 11:30, I was driving past Margaret's house. The bus was completely empty, but as I approached her stop, I found myself thinking about her, as I often did. For some reason, I felt an overwhelming urge to stop the bus outside her house, as if someone were waiting to board. Though I could see the stop was empty, the urge was so strong that I did it anyway. I opened the doors and waited a moment. A cold rush of air entered the bus, and I closed the doors and drove on. For the next 5 minutes, I could feel a presence on the bus. About 6 stops later, I felt someone standing next to my cab, as if waiting to get off. I stopped again and opened the doors. I felt the presence leave, and I continued my route, slightly confused. This morning, I received a call from Margaret's son, telling me she had passed away 2 nights ago in her home, around 11 o'clock. I broke down in tears. I had forgotten about the strange feeling I'd had the night before, until he mentioned the funeral arrangements. Later, I discovered that I had dropped off the presents at the stop nearest to her son's house, just 30 seconds away. Perhaps I'm being foolish, but I'm certain I picked up a present from right outside Margaret's house, 30 minutes after she passed, and dropped it off at her son's house. Could I have taken Margaret's soul on one final journey to see her son before she moved on? I want to believe I did, finding comfort in the idea that I drove her one last time, allowing her to bid a final farewell to her beloved son. It might sound strange, but in all my years of driving, I've never experienced anything quite like it. Sometimes the most meaningful journeys are the ones we can't explain. And I'd like to think I helped Margaret make her last and most important stop. My mom still tells this story 25 years later, and her face turns pale every time. When I was 2, I lost my favorite toy, a small green dragon figurine. For whatever reason, this tiny dragon was my constant companion, never leaving my side. When it disappeared, I was inconsolable, crying for months. My parents turned the house upside down looking for it. They moved every piece of furniture, pulled out the car seats, emptied every box, cabinet, and drawer in the house, but the dragon was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. Then came the day of Grandpa's funeral. My mom sat me up on the kitchen counter to put my shoes on. She turned around for just a second to pick up my shoes from the floor, and when she turned back, the dragon was in my hand. Through tears, she asked me where I had found it. 2-year-old me simply replied, Grandpa gave it to me. Where is he now? She asked, her voice trembling. He left, I said matter-of-factly. He had to go home. He said he loves us. Then I continued playing with my dragon as if nothing extraordinary had happened, leaving my mother standing there in stunned silence. The dragon still sits on my shelf today, a reminder that sometimes the things we lose find their way back to us in the most unexpected ways, sometimes with a little help from the other side. My husband and I were exploring the wilderness outside Yellowstone on an ATV trail ride, and we got so far ahead of our tour group that we stopped on the path to wait for them to catch up. That's when I saw something emerge from behind a tall pine tree. It looked like a silvery mist, similar to fog but more structured. And then I instantly recognized it as my brother Michael. In my mind, I heard his voice clearly say that someone I loved deeply would pass away before the year's end. He told me it would be incredibly difficult for me to handle, but that he would be there to help me through it. This happened in mid-August, and I spent the next 4 months in a state of anxious anticipation, wondering who it might be. On Wednesday, December 18th, I made my weekly call to Annie, our former housekeeper who had been with us since 1958, when I was just a baby. She was the one person in my life who had always offered unconditional love, never raising her voice, never judging, always listening with understanding no matter what I confessed to her. One of her daughters answered the phone and delivered the devastating news. Annie had suffered a stroke that had severely damaged the left side of her brain, leaving her in a vegetative state. I desperately wanted to visit her, but she was in another state, and my children were flying in for Christmas that weekend. I couldn't bear the thought of missing them. Throughout those difficult weeks, I distinctly felt Michael's presence around me. Annie's family removed life support that Saturday, and she passed peacefully. I flew to my hometown in mid-January as previously planned, originally intending to visit my mother and take Annie out for her 89th birthday, but instead attended her memorial service. In February, I needed to have a difficult conversation with my husband. As I sat down, feeling incredibly nervous, I felt Michael come up behind me and wrap his arms around me. Then I heard him whisper clearly in my ear, "It's going to be okay, I promise. It's going to be okay." Michael and Annie have continued to make their presence known during particularly challenging times, especially when I was going through trauma therapy. Their spiritual support has been a constant reminder that love truly does transcend the boundary between life and death, offering comfort and guidance when we need it most. I had an encounter with an old friend years ago, back in 1999. I'm a musician who has played in various bands throughout the years. We had a proper studio for practice and recording, the whole setup. My old friend Marcus had stepped in to help with drumming while we searched for a permanent drummer. I'd known him for years before this arrangement. Eventually, we found our permanent drummer and thanked Marcus for his help. Months passed, and we lost the lease on our studio, which led to the band breaking up. A few months later, I got an offer to play guitar in a country band. Things were looking up. We had a CD and a financial backer who owned recording studios, and was even talking about buying us a tour bus. It couldn't have been better. Then everything fell apart when our vocalist, who never drank, got drunk and cursed out our financial backer. We lost everything. I packed up and headed for the Pacific Northwest, found a new band, and started performing again. A year later, my job transferred me back home to Tennessee. Every year, our town hosts a band and jam competition. This particular year, I was just there to watch. While listening to one of the bands, I felt someone push me from behind. It was Marcus, accompanied by a beautiful woman I'd never seen before. Not his wife, but they both looked fantastic. He appeared healthier than I'd ever seen him. We chatted about music and caught up on life. He mentioned he'd sold his drums and hadn't been playing much, which surprised me. Then he suggested getting another beer. We grabbed our drinks and continued listening to the band. During the break between sets, I went to the bathroom. When I returned, Marcus had vanished. 2 weeks later, I was visiting some musician friends, a singer friend who'd married another drummer. She asked if I'd attended the band jam, and I mentioned seeing Marcus there. She became furious, accusing me of lying. She revealed that Marcus had died almost a year ago. He had been in Florida and was struck by a vehicle. I couldn't believe it. She wouldn't even let me explain what I'd experienced. Later, I spoke with his widow, who confirmed he had indeed sold his drum kit before his death. When I shared my story, she simply said, "Oh, that's interesting," and I left it at that. I've come to accept that what I experienced was real. I spent about 30 minutes hanging out with my old friend, sharing a beer and conversation, even though he had passed away months before. I initially wondered if he might have faked his death, but after talking to those who attended his funeral, well, he was definitely gone. The fact remains that I spoke with him, saw him, and shared one last beer with an old friend. It's something I can't explain, but I know it happened. Sometimes I wonder if he came back just to say goodbye in his own way, giving us both one final moment of normal friendship before moving on. I am of Indian heritage, specifically a Punjabi Sikh, and in our culture, some people believe in spirits called pretas. From what I understand, pretas are spirits connected to you, often family members who remain tethered to earth. It's said they sometimes take belongings from the living, and I've been dealing with this phenomenon for years. Recently, it's become almost unbearable. The first incident occurred when I was young. My mother, who kept cash in the house, discovered that $7,000 had vanished. Since only the two of us lived there, there was no one else who could have taken it. Later, another $3,000 disappeared, just as mysteriously. Years later, something even more peculiar happened. My mother asked me to retrieve a necklace from her bank safety deposit box. The box also contained her wedding jewelry, gifts from her parents. But when she went to get it, the jewelry had inexplicably disappeared, with no explanation of how it could have vanished from a secured box. Then things started happening to me personally. One day, while sitting on the couch, I noticed one of my silver hoop earrings was missing. I searched the entire house for hours without success. Eventually, I gave up, only to find it suddenly appear right in front of me on the floor, as if it had been deliberately placed there. But there's more. I have a gold chain with deep sentimental value. It was given to my mother by my grandmother on my father's side when my parents married, and then my mother passed it to me. My grandmother never approved of my mother or me, and my parents are now divorced. One day, I realized the chain was gone, even though I had just photographed myself wearing it for a friend. I searched everywhere but couldn't find it. Frustrated, I went upstairs to tell my mother, and when I returned downstairs, the chain was lying on the sofa as if someone had just placed it there. At this point, my aunt in India consulted a spiritual advisor who said this was the work of a male spirit connected to our family. Things quieted down for a while, and I thought it was over, but a month ago, the incident started again. While visiting family in London, I woke up one morning to find one of my earrings missing. My family and I thoroughly searched the hotel room, but found nothing. That night I saw the shadow of a short person running by, which I tried to dismiss. Later, when my mother contacted the spiritual advisor again, they said it was my grandmother who had taken the earring. What made it more chilling was that my grandmother had indeed been a short woman. After returning home, the activity intensified. My favorite blouse disappeared, then a costume ring I loved, followed by more earrings and a bracelet. The final straw came today. Last year, during my birthday visit to India, my aunt, who doesn't have much money, gave me the most meaningful gift, a gold bracelet I'd always dreamed of owning. Today, when I went to wear it, the bracelet was gone. I'm completely drained from dealing with this situation. The items that disappear often hold deep emotional significance, making their loss even more painful. If anyone knows how to stop this from happening, or better yet, how to retrieve my belongings, I would be eternally grateful. The constant disappearance of cherished items has become more than just a nuisance. It's taking an emotional toll that's becoming harder to bear. When I was a child, I witnessed an apparition that would forever change my understanding of the supernatural. My mother and I both saw exactly the same entity, though I didn't notice it immediately. It was only when my mother urged me to get out of our wooden bunk bed that I became aware of something unusual. This occurred while we were living in Marseille, France, in an apartment on Avenue Saint-Pierre. We occupied the first floor, and I was living through what felt like hell at the time. My mother had fled from my father due to his violent behavior, and I had become the target of bullying at school. To make matters worse, the neighbors in the apartment above us regularly disrupted our sleep with their chaotic behavior, throwing dishes in their bathtub, banging furniture, pounding on walls, and shouting throughout the night. I was sleeping soundly that night until my mother's urgent voice broke through my slumber, telling me there was some kind of otherworldly presence that had appeared to her. Initially, I refused to join her, desperately wanting to continue sleeping, but eventually gave in to her persistence. As I moved to the ladder on all fours, I noticed something extraordinary. An ethereal blue light was reflecting off the ceiling and throughout the room. This was particularly strange because we had turned everything off for the night. I could also hear our upstairs neighbors engaged in what sounded like intense ritual chanting, loud enough for us to hear clearly. As I descended the ladder, I fought against the urge to look to my right, where the blue light seemed to originate. It was only after joining my mother in her bed, and after several requests from her, that I finally gathered the courage to face this entity directly. What we saw was horrifying. A half-skeletal apparition emanating an otherworldly blue light. The creature bore an uncanny resemblance to my maternal grandfather. It spoke to us, but we were too terrified to process its words. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity vanished, plunging us into complete darkness. The moment it disappeared, the neighbors abruptly ceased their chanting. We heard them running, their footsteps thundering down the stairs as if fleeing from some unseen pursuit. The sound of their shoes squealing against the steps echoed through the building as they rushed down each flight. Finally, we heard them burst through the main door of the building, slamming it with such force that the sound reverberated through the entire structure. That was the last we ever heard from those neighbors, and to this day, I'm grateful for that fact. The experience left an indelible mark on both my mother and me, serving as a chilling reminder that there are things in this world that defy rational explanation. I often find myself replaying the events that unfolded during my teenage years in Montana, particularly the summer when I turned 16. My family had just relocated from bustling Seattle to a remote property nestled in the Bitterroot Valley. The move was prompted by my father's new position as a wildlife biologist with the state's conservation department. Our new home sat on a sprawling 20-acre plot, with the Snake River winding through the western edge of the property. The house itself was a classic ranch-style structure, its weathered wooden exterior telling stories of decades gone by. The previous owners had maintained the property well, though the surrounding land had grown wild and untamed. 2 weeks after settling in, I was performing my usual chore of mowing the meadow behind our house. I was operating my dad's ancient John Deere tractor, equipped with a massive 6-foot mower attachment. The summer heat was intense, and sweat trickled down my back as I carefully navigated the uneven terrain. The incident occurred as I was making my way down a gentle slope. The tractor suddenly lurched violently, the wheels hitting something solid beneath the tall grass. The impact nearly threw me from my seat. After disengaging the mower, I cautiously backed up the tractor and dismounted to investigate. What I discovered made my blood run cold. There, partially exposed by the mower's blades, were 4 stone markers arranged in a perfect line. They weren't ordinary rocks, these were clearly grave markers, each one a massive slab of local granite, weathered by countless seasons, but unmistakably placed by human hands. Storm, our German shepherd, who had been following me around during my chores, approached the stones cautiously. Her usual playful demeanor vanished, replaced by an unusual alertness. Her ears stood straight up, and she remained unnaturally still, staring at the markers. My parents immediately began reaching out to local experts, archaeologists, historians, and native cultural experts. The consensus was unanimous and chilling. We had stumbled upon an Apache burial ground dating back to the mid-19th century. The experts explained that the positioning of the graves on the hillside was intentional, designed to prevent water from seeping into the burial sites during the spring thaw. That's when the strange occurrences began. At first, it was subtle, the sound of heavy knocking against our house's exterior walls late at night. The knocking would circle the house, following no discernible pattern. Then came the footsteps, quick, light steps that would race across our roof in the darkness. Storm would pace anxiously during these episodes, whimpering and pressing herself against my legs. The activity escalated over the following weeks. One particularly memorable night, I was letting Storm out for her evening bathroom break. As I opened the back door facing the river, I heard what sounded like leaves rustling across the ground. Looking up at the trees, I noticed there wasn't even a hint of breeze. The sound grew closer, transforming into what I can only describe as whispering, but not in any language I recognized. It was ancient, guttural, and distinctly unsettling. Storm's reaction confirmed I wasn't imagining things. Her fur stood on end, and she released a low, threatening growl unlike anything I'd heard from her before. She was frozen in place, staring intently at something I couldn't see. The whispers grew louder until they seemed to be right in front of us. The air turned thick with the smell of sage and wood smoke, and I felt an overwhelming wave of nausea. Suddenly, Storm lunged forward, snapping at the empty air. I grabbed her collar and yanked her back inside, slamming the door shut. The door frame shook violently as something pounded against it from the outside. We spent the rest of the night in the center of the house, Storm trembling in my lap while the pounding continued until dawn. The most terrifying incident occurred when I returned home from football practice one evening. I was carrying my gear bag over my shoulder as I entered through the front door into our library. The room was furnished with leather armchairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and an antique piano near the window. As I began lowering my bag, movement caught my eye. There, in my peripheral vision, was a figure seated in one of the armchairs. It appeared to be reading, head bowed over an invisible book. The entity was human-shaped, but composed of complete darkness, not shadow, but a void that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Long black hair cascaded over its face, and its form seemed to ripple like smoke in still air. My heart nearly stopped. I stumbled backward against the door, a scream caught in my throat. The figure's head snapped up, and though it had no discernible features, I felt it staring directly at me. In an instant, it launched itself across the room, moving like a blur of darkness along the wall before disappearing through the bay window overlooking the river. Storm, who had been in the next room, came tearing in, barking frantically and chasing the darkness along the walls. She eventually returned to my side, pressing against me until my parents came home. As time passed, we learned more about our property's history from Professor Morrison, a local historian. He explained that this land had once been part of an Apache settlement, and the graves belonged to a family who had died defending their home during a particularly harsh winter. The final incident occurred during a failed attempt to prove to some skeptical friends that our experiences were real. We visited the Apache Spirit Cave, a local landmark known for paranormal activity. Despite my warnings, one friend decided to mock the spirits, shouting challenges into the darkness. The response was immediate and terrifying. A thick mist rolled in from the river, accompanied by a bone-chilling drop in temperature. The air filled with the sound of deep, raspy breathing, like wind howling through a deep cavern. We could hear the sound of footsteps crushing the dried vegetation all around us, drawing closer and closer. Then came the sniffing, loud, animal-like snuffling that seemed to be hunting us through the fog. We ran, but not before something struck me in the back with tremendous force. Later examination revealed a massive bruise, perfectly circular, like I'd been hit by a large stone. These experiences changed my perspective on reality forever. While I've since moved away from Montana, I often think about those graves and the spirits that guarded them. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear phantom footsteps and feel unseen eyes watching from the shadows, reminding me that there are things in this world that defy rational explanation. The Evergreen Psychiatric Center stands as one of Portland's most distinguished medical institutions. Its Victorian architecture, a stark contrast to the modern city sprawling around it. As a psychiatric resident in my second year, I've grown accustomed to the building's peculiarities, the creaking hardwood floors, the oddly placed mirrors, and the perpetual scent of old books and lavender that seems to permeate every corridor. My encounter with the inexplicable began during a particularly busy night shift. The autumn rain was drumming against the tall windows, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm throughout the empty halls. I was covering the East Wing, where our long-term patients resided, when Nurse Winters called me to check on an elderly patient who was in visible distress. As I approached room 217, I noticed an unusual coldness in the air. Mrs. Hamilton, our 73-year-old patient with advanced dementia, was crying uncontrollably. What caught my attention wasn't just her tears, but the way she kept pointing to the corner of the room, whispering, "She's here for me. She's always been here for me." The corner she pointed to was empty, yet something about it made the hair on my neck stand up. I attempted to calm Mrs. Hamilton, but she became increasingly agitated, insisting that she was evil when he was alive, and even more evil now. Confused, I asked if she was referring to someone she knew. Through her tears, Mrs. Hamilton explained that her deceased daughter-in-law had been appearing in her room for days, tormenting her. She described how the spirit would stand in the corner, watching, waiting. The woman had made Mrs. Hamilton's life a living hell during her marriage to her son, and now, even in death, she wouldn't leave her alone. I've heard many patients speak of visions before. It's not uncommon in our line of work, but something about Mrs. Hamilton's terror felt genuine, raw, and utterly convincing. The temperature in the room had dropped so low I could see my breath, despite the heating system running at full capacity. Nurse Winters, a woman who had worked at Evergreen for over 20 years, stood beside me, her face pale. She later confided that she had been seeing a dark figure in that room for weeks, but had dismissed it as exhaustion from working long shifts. I offered to pray with Mrs. Hamilton, something I'd never done with a patient before. As we prayed, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The oppressive cold gradually lifted, and Mrs. Hamilton's breathing steadied. Before falling into a peaceful sleep, she whispered that she could no longer see her daughter-in-law's spirit. The following morning, I discussed the incident with Dr. Fielding, our chief psychiatrist. To my surprise, he didn't dismiss my account. Instead, he pulled out an old patient file from the hospital's archives. The yellowed pages contained records from 1972, documenting the case of Alina Prescott, Mrs. Hamilton's daughter-in-law, who had been a patient at Evergreen before her death. Alina had been admitted for severe depression and violent tendencies. The records described how she would stand in corners for hours, staring at walls, speaking in whispers to unseen entities. She died in that very room, 217, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Dr. Fielding revealed that over the years, multiple staff members had reported strange occurrences in that room. Unexplained cold spots, whispers in the dark, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched. Some patients refused to stay there, claiming they could see a woman standing in the corner, her eyes filled with malice. Mrs. Hamilton passed away peacefully in her sleep a week later. Before her death, she told me she was no longer afraid. The spirit had stopped appearing after our prayer session, as if something had finally allowed it to move on. Since that night, I've approached my patients' claims of supernatural experiences with a different perspective, in a place where the line between reality and delusion often blurs. I've learned that sometimes the most rational approach is to accept that there are things in this world that defy rational explanation. The corner in room 217 remains empty now, but occasionally, late at night, when the rain drums against the windows and the old building settles into silence, I still feel a chill run down my spine as I pass by. Perhaps some spirits, like some memories, never truly leave the places they once called home. The autumn of 1995 marked a significant turning point in my life. At 15, I found myself moving into one of Salem's most imposing Victorian mansions. A towering 3-story structure that my parents had purchased to transform into their dream bed and breakfast. The Oakwood Estate, as it was known locally, stood proudly on Maple Street, its weathered facade bearing witness to over a century of history. My father, Robert, a former restaurant manager, and my mother, Maria, had invested their life savings into this venture. The house was a bargain, suspiciously so, but we were too excited about our new beginning to question our good fortune. My brother James and I were given our pick of rooms. He chose one on the ground floor near our parents', while I opted for a cozy space in the basement level, attracted by its bay window and vintage charm. The house seemed to welcome us at first. Its ornate woodwork, original stained glass windows, and sweeping staircase spoke of an elegance from a bygone era. However, certain areas carried an inexplicable heaviness. Room 7 on the top floor, in particular, possessed a suffocating quality that made even routine cleaning feel like an ordeal. The air would grow thick, accompanied by a high-pitched ringing that you'd only notice once you left the room. Our first supernatural encounter occurred within months of moving in. A couple with their 10-year-old daughter were staying in room 7. The parents had gone down to enjoy our newly renovated bar area, leaving their daughter, Amy, to watch television. The peace was shattered when another guest burst into the bar, asking if anyone was staying in room 7. They'd heard screaming. We rushed upstairs to find Amy in hysterics, her small body trembling beneath the covers. When my mother gently coaxed her to explain what had happened, she described seeing a tall man in a top hat and formal Victorian attire. He had prominent sideburns, she said, and had appeared beside her bed, telling her to sleep well, child, in an unnervingly gentle voice. The description sent chills down my spine, not because it was particularly frightening, but because I'd seen the same figure weeks earlier, his reflection glimpsed in the hallway mirror when I was cleaning. I dismissed it as a trick of light and shadow. More incidents followed. One afternoon, a guest sitting in our bar area suddenly turned to my mother and enthusiastically asked about the historical reenactor. She'd just seen a distinguished gentleman in full Victorian dress who descended the main staircase. My mother, puzzled, explained that we didn't employ any reenactors. The guest insisted she'd seen him clear as day, describing the same top-hatted figure and sideburns. The most compelling evidence of our supernatural residence came from our establishment's youngest visitor, Thomas. We discovered later that in 1872, a young boy by that name had lived and died in the house. His presence became a regular occurrence, particularly on the ground floor, near what used to be the servants' quarters. Late one night, I encountered Thomas myself. I was restocking linens when I heard the distinct sound of a child's laughter. Following the sound, I found myself in the old servants' corridor. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a small boy around 8 or 9 years old, dressed in period clothing. He smiled at me, not menacingly, but with a kind of lonely sadness that broke my heart. "You can see me," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. Before I could respond, he vanished, leaving only the faint scent of candle wax in the air. The mansion's paranormal activity seemed to center around specific areas. The top floor, particularly room 7, remained a hotspot. Guests would report the sensation of being watched. Objects would move on their own, and sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, the sound of pacing footsteps would echo through the ceiling. My mother, initially skeptical, began researching the house's history. Through local records and historical societies, she discovered that the mansion had been built by Dr. William Oakwood, a prominent physician, in 1868. Thomas had been his son, who tragically died from scarlet fever 4 years later. The doctor himself passed away in the house in 1900, and according to local legend, never really left. As the years passed, we learned to coexist with our supernatural housemates. Thomas would occasionally play harmless pranks, hiding keys or moving small objects. The gentleman in the top hat, whom we presumed to be Dr. Oakwood, maintained a dignified presence, appearing most often in room 7 or on the main staircase. We owned the mansion for 8 years before selling it to developers who converted it into luxury apartments. I often wonder if the new residents experience the same mysterious occurrences we did. Sometimes, when I drive past the old place, I swear I can see a small figure waving from my old basement window, and a tall, distinguished gentleman standing watch from room 7 above. The experience taught me that not all hauntings are malevolent. Sometimes, spirits remain simply because they're attached to a place they once called home. In the case of the Oakwood estate, I like to think we shared our home with echoes of its past, each of us learning to respect the other's presence in that grand old house. Working security at the Crimson Valley Cannabis Farm wasn't my first choice of employment, but the pay was decent and the solitude appealed to me. The facility was nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies, far removed from civilization, perfect for growing a crop that still attracted unwanted attention despite its legal status. The property had an interesting history. Before its current incarnation as a state-of-the-art growing facility, it had been a lavender farm throughout most of the 20th century. The original farmhouses still stood at the northern end of the property, their weathered facades a testament to decades of mountain winters. Only one served as our office space now. The others stored equipment and supplies. The layout was impressive. 3 massive growing fields stretched to the east, west, and south, each approximately 100 acres. 7 modern greenhouses stood sentinel near the admin area, enclosed by high security fencing. 2 large equipment garages completed the facility, one attached to the greenhouse complex and another across the lot. As the newest hire, I was assigned the graveyard shift, working alone from 4 in the afternoon until 6 in the morning. The isolation didn't bother me at first. If anything, the mountain silence felt peaceful. I established a routine: regular perimeter checks, monitoring security cameras, and passing time with books or online articles between rounds. The first incident occurred around 2 in the morning, about 3 months into my employment. I was watching the security feeds when a dark mass seemed to vault over the greenhouse fence. My training kicked in. I secured my office, grabbed my flashlight, and headed out to investigate. The weight of my sidearm provided little comfort as I approached the greenhouse area. The night was clear, stars brilliant against the mountain sky. I methodically checked each greenhouse, finding nothing out of place. After 20 minutes of searching, I was ready to chalk it up to shadows playing tricks on the cameras. But something felt wrong. The mountain air, usually crisp and clean, had grown heavy, almost oppressive. I reviewed the security footage later, only to discover the hard drive had failed precisely when the incident occurred. Our tech team replaced it, and life returned to normal for a while. Weeks later, around midnight, I heard it, a blood-curdling scream that shattered the mountain silence. It came from behind the greenhouses, where the center field began. My first thought was mountain lion. They weren't uncommon in the area. But then I heard crying, distinctly human and female. Protocol dictated I should wait for backup, but the crying sounded so genuinely distressed. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sobbing grew louder as I neared, but I couldn't locate its source. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped, not gradually, but like someone had flipped a switch. I stood perfectly still, straining to hear anything beyond my own breathing. The silence felt alive, watching, waiting. The temperature plummeted, and I caught the distinct odor of burning sage. Without warning, the crying resumed, this time directly behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The sound seemed to move, circling me in the darkness. My training abandoned me. I ran back to the security office, my heart pounding. I spent the remainder of my shift with every light blazing, jumping at each creak and groan of the old building. The activity escalated. One night I brought my German shepherd, Atlas, for company. He was normally stoic and fearless, but something about the property set him on edge. Sometimes he would growl at empty corners, his hackles raised, tracking something invisible across the room. The most terrifying encounter happened weeks later. I'd parked my vehicle near the greenhouses to monitor the heating systems during a particularly cold night. Around 3 in the morning, a loud bang resonated against my truck's roof. I scanned the area with my spotlight, but saw nothing. Then another bang, followed by dirt cascading down my windshield. I radioed for backup, and my supervisor arrived within 30 minutes. As we discussed the situation, a distinct whistle cut through the night, 2 notes, playful, almost mocking. We searched the perimeter, but found nothing. Yet the moment my supervisor left, the whistle returned, closer this time. The final incident occurred on Christmas Day. I'd picked up an extra shift for the holiday pay, choosing to stay in the office rather than patrol. That's when I heard it, classical music, flowing and elegant, like what you'd hear at a sophisticated dinner party. The sound would stop when I stepped outside my office, only to resume the moment I returned. Later that night, the music faded into silence, replaced by heavy footsteps circling the building. My German shepherd, usually eager to investigate any disturbance, refused to leave my side, growling at unseen presences. I learned later from a local historian that the property had a darker history than its lavender farming past suggested. In the late 1800s, it had been the site of a mining camp. A terrible accident had claimed the lives of several miners, including a young woman who had disguised herself as a man to work the claims. I still work security, but no longer on the night shift. Sometimes, though, when I drive past the facility during the day, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows dancing at the edge of the fields, and occasionally the faint sound of classical music drifting on the mountain breeze. My brother and I never expected our first apartment to come with permanent residence of the supernatural variety. We'd found the place in Newport, Rhode Island, a charming 2-story duplex overlooking the historic harbor. The rent was surprisingly affordable, especially considering the location and the building's obvious architectural character. The structure dated back to the early 1900s, its weather-worn shingles and ornate trim speaking to a distinctly New England aesthetic. While the exterior maintained its historical charm, the interior was a study in incomplete renovation. Certain outdoor areas showed signs of decay, and some walls upstairs remained partially unpainted, giving the space an unsettling, unfinished quality. According to our landlord, we were the first tenants since a recent renovation project. Our parents would visit occasionally, staying in our spare room, and it was during these visits that we first began noticing the oddities that would become our constant companions. The apartment always carried what I can only describe as an uncomfortable aura. The staircase, in particular, generated an almost primal sense of unease. I constantly felt as though if I looked down from the top landing, I'd see something, or someone, dash across the lower level. This wasn't a random fear. It was a specific, persistent sensation that I shared with my parents before any incidents occurred. It started with subtle disturbances, random noises, items being mysteriously relocated, lights flickering. We initially attributed these occurrences to the building's age and our own forgetfulness. However, one Friday night forever changed our perspective on what we were dealing with. I was home alone with my mother, watching television in the upstairs living room around 9 in the evening. Without warning, we experienced something neither of us had felt before or since, a sudden atmospheric pressure change that made our ears pop. The air seemed to be literally sucked out of the room, leaving us frozen in place, unable to move. That's when we saw it. A shadowy figure materialized on the wall to the left of the television. It wasn't a simple shadow cast by furniture or outside lighting. This entity had mass and dimension. The shape resembled a human form, but appeared to be climbing diagonally up the wall, moving with an unnatural fluidity. We watched, paralyzed, as it ascended before vanishing into the ceiling. The next incident occurred weeks later. I had just returned from watching a film at the local cinema. Something about electronic voice phenomena and spirit communication. As I lay in bed that night, my clock radio suddenly burst to life at full volume, shattering the silence. In my panic-stricken state, I couldn't manage to turn it off. After 10 seconds of chaos, it went silent on its own. The following morning, I discovered the radio's power cord lying in the middle of the room, completely unplugged. This defied any rational explanation. The cord had been firmly plugged in when I went to bed. During a gathering with friends, our old CD player, which hadn't been used in months, spontaneously activated at maximum volume, playing an eerie, discordant melody none of us recognized. Later that evening, we heard what sounded like a young woman's scream emanating from upstairs. The one friend suggested it came from a neighbor's house. The sound was unmistakably from directly above us. The activity intensified. One night, while my mother was visiting, I awoke to the sound of table tennis being played in our attached garage. The rhythmic ping-pong sounds were crystal clear, despite the impossibility of anyone being in there. When I mentioned this to my mother the next morning, her face went pale. She'd heard the same sounds around 3 in the morning. Perhaps the most chilling incident occurred when my brother was home alone one evening. He received a call from me, or so he thought, asking about the sound of keys jingling at the front door. The problem was, I was miles away at a friend's house. Moments after hanging up, he heard what sounded like a large animal running along the side of the house, followed by aggressive knocking at the back door. When he investigated, there was nothing there. Our research into the property's history revealed that the land had once belonged to a prominent shipping merchant. Local legends spoke of tragic accidents along the harbor, and some suggested that the souls of drowned sailors still wandered the shoreline. Years later, I still can't explain everything we experienced in that apartment. The rational part of my mind searches for logical explanations, old pipes, settling foundations, overactive imaginations. But late at night, when I remember the shadow climbing our wall or the phantom table tennis matches, I know we encountered something beyond ordinary explanation. We eventually moved out, but I often drive by the old place when I'm in Newport. The building stands much as it did then, its weathered facade hiding whatever secrets still reside within its walls. Sometimes I wonder if the current tenants lie awake at night, listening to the sound of phantom footsteps or the ethereal melody of an unplugged radio. Shadow Vale Road, nestled in the dense forests of northern Vermont, holds the dubious distinction of being the most haunted stretch of pavement in New England. My encounter with its mysteries occurred 2 years ago, during my final semester of college. I was working night shifts at a local high school, which left my weekends free for exploration and adventure. One Friday evening, my friend group called to tell me they were planning to investigate Shadow Vale Road. Unable to join them due to work, I listened with growing skepticism. as they later described their experienced tales of ghostly trucks, mysterious lights, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Their excitement was contagious, and we agreed to return the following night, this time with me in tow. The drive from southern Vermont took about 2 hours, giving us plenty of time to share local legends about the road. According to folklore, Shadow Vale had witnessed numerous tragic accidents in the 1950s, when it served as the main logging route through the mountains. Stories spoke of phantom logging trucks still traversing the road, their ghostly drivers forever repeating their final journey. As we approached our destination, the atmosphere in the car shifted from excited chatter to tense silence. Shadow Vale Road stretched before us, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through towering pine forests. The first landmark we encountered was the Miller Mansion, a crumbling stone structure that looked more like a medieval fortress than a home. Local history suggested it had once belonged to a logging baron whose fortune was built on the exploitation of his workers. Being what my friends called the rational skeptic of the group, 6'5" and 260 pounds of pure pragmatism, I maintained my composure. However, the moment we stepped out of the car, an undeniable heaviness settled over us. The autumn air carried an unnatural chill, and the darkness between the trees seemed somehow deeper than natural shadow. Our first stop was Bridge Falls, named for its tragic history. Legend claimed that a young woman had leaped to her death there in the 1920s. Following local tradition, we tossed coins into the rushing water below. I carefully marked one of my quarters with a small notch, determined to debunk what I was certain was an elaborate prank. The coins splashed into the darkness. We waited. Nothing happened. "See," I began, but the words froze in my throat as the distinct sound of metal hitting pavement rang out behind us. There, scattered across the road, lay our coins, including my notched quarter. Shaken but still clinging to skepticism, we decided to drive deeper into Shadow Vale. The road twisted through the forest like a wounded serpent, each bend revealing new shadows and deeper darkness. Suddenly, headlights appeared in our rearview mirror. The vehicle behind us seemed to materialize from nowhere, its ancient running lights casting an eerie yellow glow. The phantom truck matched our every move, maintaining a constant distance despite our increasing speed. It navigated curves that should have been impossible for a vehicle of its size, defying both physics and reason. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the lights vanished. We pulled over to catch our breath and consult our map. The silence was absolute until it was shattered by a woman's moan echoing from the woods. There, among the trees, stood a figure in white. Before we could process what we were seeing, she released a scream that seemed to pierce our very souls. Panic took over. We scrambled back into our car, but the terror wasn't over. As we sped away, massive footsteps began crashing through the underbrush on both sides of the road. The sound seemed to come from something impossibly large, moving at incredible speed. Then came the breathing deep, cavernous inhalations that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. The air filled with the unmistakable scent of diesel fuel and pine resin. Something was hunting us through the darkness. We finally broke free of Shadow Vale Road, but our ordeal had one final surprise. As I prepared for bed that night, I discovered a massive bruise across my lower back, a perfect circular mark, as if I'd been struck by something round and heavy. None of us could explain how it got there. The next morning, we learned that Shadow Vale Road had been the site of numerous disappearances throughout its history. Local historians spoke of Native American warnings about the area, claiming the road cut through ancient burial grounds. Others mentioned a notorious serial killer who had used the road to dispose of victims in the 1970s. On our drive home, we passed a small country church. Its weathered sign board bore a simple message: "You need Jesus on Sunday." None of us has returned to Shadow Vale Road since that night, and we rarely discuss what happened there. Some places, we learned, are better left unexplored, their mysteries buried beneath layers of darkness and time. As 3 former Marine Corps veterans, we pride ourselves on facing any challenge head-on. But nothing in our military training prepared us for what we encountered at the Raven Circle that autumn night. My friend Marcus had always been fascinated by paranormal phenomena, and I shared his interest. When we discovered the legend of the Raven Circle, a mysterious clearing in the Appalachian wilderness where nothing would grow, we couldn't resist investigating. According to local folklore, the circle served as a gateway between worlds. Native American legends spoke of a dark spirit that would emerge at night, pacing the barren ground until dawn. Anyone foolish enough to sleep within the circle would supposedly hear enchanting singing, only to wake miles away with no memory of how they got there. We set out on a Friday evening after work. Myself, Marcus, and our fellow Marine Michael, who caught wind of our plans. Our 4-hour drive took us deep into the mountains, far from civilization. We didn't hit the road until 8 in the evening, delayed by multiple stops for supplies, tents, sleeping bags, chairs, and admittedly, several cases of beer. The GPS directed us down an unlit mountain road just before midnight. The darkness was absolute, broken only by our headlights. As we searched for the landmarks described online ritualistic symbols painted on the asphalt, something odd caught our attention. A pack of dogs had begun following our vehicle, at least 10 of them, led by a large black dog that moved with unsettling purpose. While the other dogs barked frantically, the black dog remained silent, appearing and reappearing along our path like a shadow, as if trying to warn us away. When we finally found the symbols marking the trail to Raven Circle, the dogs abruptly stopped following, except for the black one, which stood watching us until we were out of sight. We parked and began setting up our camp near the circle, arranging our tents in a triangle around our makeshift common area. The circle itself was exactly as described, a perfect ring of bare earth surrounded by dense forest, with not so much as a blade of grass breaking through the soil. For the first hour, we sat around sharing ghost stories and drinking beer, trying to ignore the occasional snapping twigs that sounded suspiciously like footsteps, and the persistent feeling of being watched. Around 2 in the morning, we began hearing voices, not distant or unclear, but surrounding us completely, as if we were sitting in the middle of a crowd. The voices stopped abruptly, and simultaneously, the headlights of my truck suddenly illuminated. We approached the vehicle to find all 4 doors standing open, though we'd locked them earlier. After securing the truck, we returned to our chairs, only to find ourselves enveloped in complete silence. not just quiet, but an absolute absence of sound that felt almost solid. At 2:30, the silence was broken by haunting humming, emanating from every direction at once. The melody was beautiful, but somehow wrong, like a familiar song played in a minor key. Without speaking, we all recognized this as our signal to leave. As we rushed to pack up, the temperature plummeted, and an unnatural mist began rolling in from the surrounding forest. The mist brought with it a sound that still haunts my dreams, deep, rasping breaths, like something massive drawing air through ancient lungs. The temperature continued to drop until we could see our breath, and the distinct smell of sulfur filled the air. Then came the footsteps, not human steps, but massive, crushing impacts that shattered the dried vegetation all around us. Whatever was circling us in the mist was enormous. The breathing grew closer, transforming into a horrifying sniffing sound, like some prehistoric predator tracking its prey. Panic overtook us. We ran, military training forgot, crashing through the underbrush toward the road. The entity pursued us, its footsteps gaining ground with frightening speed. Just as we reached the gravel road, something struck me from behind with tremendous force. Later examination revealed a bruise the size of a basketball on my lower back. And nearby, we found a massive rock that seemed to have been hurled with impossible strength. The incident left us with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain: something ancient and powerful resided in that clearing. Something that didn't appreciate human visitors. To this day, none of us has returned to the Raven's Circle. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I swear I can still hear that otherworldly humming, carried on the wind like a warning, or perhaps an invitation to those foolish enough to venture into places where the boundary between worlds grows thin. The Hawthorne Hotel stands as a testament to the golden age of American luxury. Its imposing facade overlooking the rolling hills of western Massachusetts. My husband surprised me with a weekend stay for my birthday, though neither of us anticipated how that single night would forever change our perspective on reality. Upon arrival, we joined one of the hotel's famous ghost tour. Our guide, an elderly gentleman with a theatrical flair, led us through the historic corridors, sharing tales of tragic deaths and unexplained phenomena. I excused myself briefly to visit the restroom, missing the conclusion of the tour and what would turn out to be crucial information about the hotel's supernatural residents. Our night began peacefully enough. The room was beautifully appointed with period furniture, and the autumn view from our window was breathtaking. However, peace gave way to terror in the early hours of the morning, when I was awakened by loud scratching at our door. The sound was deliberate and rhythmic, like claws being dragged across the wood. It stopped after about 20 seconds, only to resume with greater intensity. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. What made the situation particularly unnerving was our location. To reach our door, someone would need to pass through a keycard-protected corridor. I knew there had been no one in the hallway when we went to bed. The scratching grew louder, and it clearly emanated from the bottom of the door. I gently shook my husband awake, asking if he could hear it. The moment he stirred, the sound ceased abruptly. He laughed off my concerns, suggesting it was probably other guests in the hallway. "No," I insisted, "it's coming directly from our door." I had approached close enough to pinpoint the source exactly. My husband, still groggy, suggested I was simply looking for a ghostly encounter after the evening's tour. This irritated me. I hadn't mentioned anything supernatural. I was simply describing the very real sounds I'd heard. When we went to check out the next morning, I couldn't shake my unease. I approached the front desk clerk and asked what could have been scratching at our door at that hour. His eyes widened, and he quickly summoned another employee, an older man who'd worked at the hotel for decades. I described the incident, and the older employee's face grew serious. He explained that what I'd heard was likely the hotel's resident ghost dog, a beloved pet of the original owner who used to wake guests each morning for breakfast. My husband interjected, "Oh right, you were in the bathroom when the guide told us about the ghost dog during the tour." I nearly throttled him right there in the lobby. The entire experience had been terrifying enough without knowing there was an established history of such encounters. Apparently, the phantom dog had been a friendly presence in life, known for greeting guests and providing wake-up calls by scratching at their doors. While this explanation should have provided comfort, it only served to make the experience more real. The thought that I'd been separated from a supernatural entity by mere inches of wood still sends chills down my spine. The hotel staff shared that similar reports come in regularly, always in the early morning hours, always describing the same scratching sound. That night changed my understanding of the world around us. While I still approach supernatural claims with healthy skepticism, I can no longer dismiss them entirely. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I find myself listening for phantom scratching, wondering if our spectral friend at the Hawthorne is still performing his morning duties, eternally faithful to his long-departed master. Deep beneath the Montana Rockies, where daylight never reaches and silence has a physical weight, I experienced something that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. I'd been working in the Iron Crown mine for 6 months when I received the assignment that would change my life forever. The mine stretches thousands of feet below the surface, a labyrinth of tunnels where the only illumination comes from cap lamps and vehicle lights. The darkness is absolute, and the constant pressure of millions of tons of rock overhead creates an environment where every sound is amplified, every shadow seems to move. I was tasked with preparing an abandoned section of the mine for equipment recovery. This particular area was infamous among the miners. It was where an operator named Robert Walker had met a horrific end, crushed between 2 pieces of machinery. The accident had left such an impact that many refused to work in that section, leading management to assign me, the junior operator, to the task. The initial descent into the abandoned tunnel was unsettling. Years of disuse had allowed mineral dust to accumulate knee-deep, making visibility nearly impossible while operating my bolter. A massive vehicle used to secure the tunnel ceiling with 8-foot metal bolts. The air felt different down there, heavy with more than just dust. It felt like trespassing. I was setting up my first series of bolts when I noticed movement at the far end of the tunnel, a light moving with purpose. Underground, light means people, and people means safety. I used our standard cap lamp signals to communicate, expecting to see another worker. The light stopped abruptly when I signaled, hung motionless for several seconds, then vanished. My mind raced through possibilities. No other workers were authorized to be in this section. It wasn't safe until my work was complete. Equipment had been removed years ago, so it couldn't be reflecting off machinery. The light had responded to my signal, showing intelligence, but then disappeared impossibly. Fear began to creep in. I was too far down to walk out without my bolter, which kicked up blinding clouds of dust. Yet staying in my vehicle felt like being trapped. I opted to remain in the bolter until my backup arrived, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. The light never returned, but the feeling of being watched intensified. When my coworker finally arrived, I managed to complete the job, but the experience left me deeply unsettled. Later, I learned more about Robert Walker's accident. Witnesses said he'd been an exceptional operator, and his death made no sense given his experience level. More disturbing was the fact that his body was found with a peculiar smile, as though he'd seen something remarkable in his final moments. Some older miners whispered that he still wandered the tunnels, checking on operations, ensuring everyone's safety. That experience was enough to convince me to request a surface position. I couldn't shake the image of that light, stopping in response to my signal, as though Robert was acknowledging a fellow miner before returning to his eternal rounds in the depths of the Iron Crown mine. Working underground teaches you to trust your instincts. When the mountain speaks through creaks, groans, or perhaps something more supernatural, the wise miner listens. Some things are better left undisturbed in the eternal darkness beneath the earth. When I was 10 years old, I witnessed something that defies explanation even now, 6 years later. It was an ordinary autumn afternoon in coastal Maine, where my friends Dylan and Marcus and I were enjoying the crisp air and golden sunlight. That's when we saw it, a pristine white double-decker bus, unlike anything that belonged in our small fishing town. The appearance of the bus itself was strange enough, but what made it truly remarkable was its impossible arrival. Our neighborhood had only one access road, a narrow, winding lane that led to the main street. We hadn't heard or seen the bus approach, and given the road's layout, there was no way it could have reached that spot without passing us earlier. The vehicle seemed to belong to another era entirely. Its gleaming white paint had an almost luminous quality, and its design spoke of the 1930s or 40s. But it was the passengers that truly caught our attention. The driver was dressed in period clothing, a crisp uniform and cap that seemed to glow with the same ethereal whiteness as the bus. His hair, what we could see of it, was pure white, and his clothing seemed to emit a soft luminescence. But more striking was his companion, a woman passenger who radiated an otherworldly presence. Like the driver, she was dressed all in white, her clothing and hair sharing that same strange, glowing quality. Unlike her companion, however, she seemed aware of us. As the bus passed, she turned to look at us through the window, offering a gentle wave that carried an inexplicable warmth. The entire encounter lasted mere seconds, but time seemed to slow during that brief moment. The bus carried what I can only describe as an aura, not threatening or malevolent, but somehow both foreign and familiar at once. It filled us with a sense of wonder rather than fear. Then, in a way that still haunts my dreams, the bus simply ceased to exist. It didn't fade away or disappear into the distance. It simply stopped being there between one blink and the next. Years later, I finally shared this experience with my mother. Her response added another layer of mystery to the encounter. She revealed that around the same time, she had experienced a vivid dream about her mother, my grandmother, who had passed away shortly before I was born. In her dream, my grandmother had appeared, saying she needed to catch a bus. The coincidence might seem mundane, but my mother had never mentioned this dream before, and the timing aligned perfectly with our sighting. Some speculate that what we witnessed was a glimpse of something beyond our normal reality, perhaps a transport between worlds, carrying souls to their next destination. Others suggest it might have been a temporal anomaly, a moment where the veil between past and present grew thin enough for us to peer through. I don't claim to know what we saw that day, but I do know that the image of that pristine white bus, its ethereal passengers, and their impossible journey remains as clear in my mind as if it happened yesterday. Sometimes, on quiet autumn afternoons when the light falls just right, I find myself watching the road, half expecting to see that magnificent vehicle materialize once again, carrying its mysterious passengers to whatever destination lies beyond our understanding. Being of Japanese descent, I make an annual pilgrimage to Hokkaido during Aben, our Festival of the Dead, when the spirits of ancestors return to visit the world of the living. During one such visit, I decided to explore the outskirts of Sapporo, where the urban sprawl gives way to ancient forests and mountains. It was during this exploration that I discovered the Yurei Cemetery, a centuries-old burial ground terraced into the mountainside. At 15, I was perhaps too young to appreciate the solemnity of such places, but something about its peaceful atmosphere drew me in. The afternoon sun was intense, and the ancient stone lanterns cast welcome shadows among the weathered gravestones. After about 10 minutes of respectfully examining the old memorial stones, I began to notice subtle changes in my surroundings. First, I realized I had somehow lost my way despite my usually excellent sense of direction. The cemetery's layout had seemed simple enough higher at the edges and lower in the middle, surrounded by dense forest. Yet now the horizons seemed to shift and blur. The second change was more dramatic. Despite it being only 3 in the afternoon, darkness began creeping in. The sunlight took on a peculiar yellowish tinge, what we call tatsugere-doki in traditional Japanese, the betwixt time, when the boundary between our world and the spirit realm grows thin. A deep cold settled over me, not like plunging into icy water, but the kind of chill you feel high in the mountains, when wind finds its way through the gaps in your clothing. Then came the shadows, strange, fluid shapes moving at the corners of my vision. They undulated like ink in water, sometimes taking vaguely human forms, other times appearing as massive, distorted faces. Strangely, I felt no panic. These manifestations, while unnatural, didn't seem threatening. They moved with deliberate grace, like ancient spirits performing a ritual dance. I found myself walking toward them, thinking that if they meant harm, I could defend myself. But like mirages in the desert, they remained just beyond reach, dissipating and reforming in endless patterns. The temperature continued to drop, and an overwhelming sense of being in the wrong place of trespassing began to build. The shadows grew more numerous, their movements more purposeful. Just as the situation was becoming unbearable, I encountered a Buddhist monk who seemed genuinely surprised to find anyone in the cemetery. He informed me that the grounds were supposed to be closed at this hour. When I explained that I had entered in broad daylight, his expression changed from surprise to understanding. He led me back to the entrance, though I noticed he took a very different path than the one I remembered. At the gate, I shared my experience with him. He explained that I had encountered what we call kamikakushi, being spirited away by supernatural entities. The most shocking revelation came when he asked me to check the time. It was 6:10 in the evening. I had somehow lost over 3 hours. The monk advised me never to enter sacred grounds during Tasagerdoki, explaining that the boundary between worlds is particularly permeable at such times. Had he not found me, he suggested, I might have been taken away. A fate that has befallen others who wandered into places where the spiritual and physical worlds intersect. Years later, I still visit Hokkaido for Aben, but I make sure to conclude my cemetery visits well before the sun begins its descent. Sometimes, though, when the light takes on that peculiar golden quality and shadows begin to dance at the edge of vision, I remember the fluid shapes I saw that day and wonder what might have happened if that monk hadn't appeared to guide me back to the world of the living. Christmas Eve dinner at a roadside diner wasn't exactly what I had in mind. But when you're working late shifts in a small town, your options are limited. I finished my shift at the warehouse at 9 and noticed the neon open, sign of Randy's all-night diner still glowing in the distance. With a handful of coupons and an empty stomach, I made my decision. The problem arose when I reached the diner. The dining room was closed, with only the drive-thru operating. Being carless, I attempted to walk up to the window, but the young woman working the register firmly refused service to pedestrians. It was company policy, she explained, no exceptions. Just as my frustration was peaking, an older woman pulled up in a pristine 1970s Pontiac. She offered to let me hop in and order my food through her car. Initially, I declined, not wanting to impose, but her genuine warmth and the cold December air eventually convinced me to accept. The wait for food was unexpectedly long, causing me to miss my bus. The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret, insisted on giving me a ride home. Again, I hesitated. Despite being a fairly large man in my 30s, something about the situation made me uneasy. However, Margaret's grandmotherly demeanor and the cold night convinced me to accept. 5 minutes into our drive, she made a wrong turn. When I pointed out we were heading in the opposite direction of my apartment, Margaret's personality underwent a disturbing transformation. Her warm smile remained, but her eyes grew cold as she announced that she couldn't let me spend Christmas Eve alone. She was taking me to her house instead. I explained that I needed to get home to let my dog out, but she dismissed my concerns, instead offering cocaine and alcohol at her place. As someone in recovery, I firmly declined. Her response was to run several stop signs while refusing to let me exit the vehicle. My mind raced through scenarios. While I could physically overpower her, I had no idea what awaited at her destination. Her initial kindness now seemed calculated, the perfect disarming tactic to lower a potential victim's defenses. Fortune intervened when we approached an intersection where two cars had stopped at opposing stop signs. Margaret had to slow almost to a complete stop. In that moment, I made my move, throwing open the door and bolting from the still-moving vehicle, leaving my food behind. As I ran, I heard her car door open. Her voice called out, trying to coax me back with the same grandmother-like tone that had initially won my trust. But the mask had slipped, and I wasn't about to give her a second chance. I ran all the way home, constantly checking to ensure I wasn't being followed. Looking back, I shudder to think what might have happened if I'd still been using drugs and alcohol. Her offer of cocaine and booze might have overridden my survival instincts. Whether her intentions involved kidnapping, murder, trafficking, or worse, I'll never know. The experience gave me a new appreciation for the vulnerability many people face daily. The genius of using a harmless-looking elderly woman as bait now seems obvious. Who would suspect a grandmother of harboring sinister intentions? I never reported the incident to the police, partly from embarrassment and partly from fear. They wouldn't believe a man my size could be legitimately frightened by an elderly woman. But sometimes I wonder, if I had reported it, might I have prevented someone else from falling victim to her seemingly innocent offer of kindness? The incident transformed my understanding of predatory behavior. Danger doesn't always present itself in obvious forms. Sometimes it comes wrapped in grandmotherly concern and Christmas Eve generosity, making it all the more insidious and effective. Living in Phoenix's rougher outskirts means encountering strange characters is practically a daily occurrence. As a 16-year-old skateboarder, I've learned to navigate these encounters with caution. Still, nothing prepared me for the unsettling experience I had one autumn evening at the local skate park. It was around 9:30, and the desert air had finally cooled enough to make skating enjoyable. The park was nearly empty, except for another skater I'd met that night. We'd been practicing tricks and sharing tips for about an hour, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. That peace was shattered when a man approached the park, accompanied by a small child. Immediately, several details set off alarm bells. The child was barefoot despite the rough concrete, wearing only thin cotton clothes in the cool evening air. The man, in contrast, wore heavy camouflage and what appeared to be a concealed weapon beneath his oversized hoodie. He approached us with an unsettling familiarity, first talking to my new acquaintance about being a barber and offering his services. The conversation felt rehearsed, artificial. When he turned to me with the same pitch, my unease intensified. Then came the first red flag. He asked if his son could try my skateboard. Despite my reservations, I agreed, not wanting to escalate the situation. The child seemed reluctant, almost fearful. The man had to physically lift the boy onto the board, his hands lingering too long on the child's arms. While the child balanced precariously on my board, the man repeated his barber story, but this time referred to the boy as his nephew. The inconsistency made my stomach turn. After about 10 minutes, my skating partner left, leaving me alone with this increasingly suspicious pair. The man insisted I perform a trick for his nephew. physically holding the child's head in place to watch. His grip looked uncomfortable, controlling. After I complied, he reverted to calling the boy his son again. When I questioned the contradiction, his response was chillingly casual. "Oh yeah, sorry, I get confused sometimes." I made an excuse to leave, but the situation grew more disturbing. He announced they were leaving too, as his dad was coming to pick them up. I watched them get into a car and drive away. But instead of leaving the area, they followed me to the nearby McDonald's where I'd planned to get dinner. "What a coincidence," he said, approaching me again. I was hungry too. His smile never reached his eyes. Then came the request that confirmed my worst fears. He asked for my phone number. I declined and left immediately, but the encounter haunted me. Who was that child? Was he really related to the man? The inconsistencies in his story, the child's obvious discomfort, the weapon, the attempt to get my contact information. It all painted a picture too disturbing to ignore. Looking back, I wonder if I should have called the police. But what could I report? A man with a child acting strange at a skate park. The situation highlights the terrible uncertainty victims often face, knowing something is wrong, but lacking concrete proof to justify intervention. I never saw them at the skate park again, but I often think about that child, hoping he's safe, hoping my intuition was wrong. The incident taught me that danger doesn't always announce itself clearly. Sometimes it comes disguised as casual conversation and friendly offers, making it all the more important to trust your instincts when they tell you something isn't right. Living in Phoenix's rougher outskirts means encountering strange characters is practically a daily occurrence. As a 16-year-old skateboarder, I've learned to navigate these encounters with caution. Still, nothing prepared me for the unsettling experience I had one autumn evening at the local skate park. It was around 9:30, and the desert air had finally cooled enough to make skating enjoyable. The park was nearly empty, except for another skater I'd met that night. We'd been practicing tricks and sharing tips for about an hour, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. That peace was shattered when a man approached the park, accompanied by a small child. Immediately, several details set off alarm bells. The child was barefoot despite the rough concrete, wearing only thin cotton clothes in the cool evening air. The man, in contrast, wore heavy camouflage and what appeared to be a concealed weapon beneath his oversized hoodie. He approached us with an unsettling familiarity, first talking to my new acquaintance about being a barber and offering his services. The conversation felt rehearsed, artificial. When he turned to me with the same pitch, my unease intensified. Then came the first red flag. He asked if his son could try my skateboard. Despite my reservations, I agreed, not wanting to escalate the situation. The child seemed reluctant, almost fearful. The man had to physically lift the boy onto the board, his hands lingering too long on the child's arms. While the child balanced precariously on my board, the man repeated his barber story, but this time referred to the boy as his nephew. The inconsistency made my stomach turn. After about 10 minutes, my skating partner left, leaving me alone with this increasingly suspicious pair. The man insisted I perform a trick for his nephew, physically holding the child's head in place to watch. His grip looked uncomfortable, controlling. After I complied, he reverted to calling the boy his son again. When I questioned the contradiction, his response was chillingly casual. "Oh yeah, sorry, I get confused sometimes." I made an excuse to leave, but the situation grew more disturbing. He announced they were leaving too, as his dad was coming to pick them up. I watched them get into a car and drive away. But instead of leaving the area, they followed me to the nearby McDonald's where I'd planned to get dinner. "What a coincidence," he said, approaching me again. I was hungry too. His smile never reached his eyes. Then came the request that confirmed my worst fears. He asked for my phone number. I declined and left immediately, but the encounter haunted me. Who was that child? Was he really related to the man? The inconsistencies in his story, the child's obvious discomfort, the weapon, the attempt to get my contact information. It all painted a picture too disturbing to ignore. Looking back, I wonder if I should have called the police. But what could I report? A man with a child acting strange at a skate park. The situation highlights the terrible uncertainty victims often face, knowing something is wrong, but lacking concrete proof to justify intervention. I never saw them at the skate park again, but I often think about that child, hoping he's safe, hoping my intuition was wrong. The incident taught me that danger doesn't always announce itself clearly. Sometimes it comes disguised as casual conversation and friendly offers, making it all the more important to trust your instincts when they tell you something isn't right. At 18, I underwent major cardiac surgery following a training accident during my time in the Naval Academy. What happened during that procedure has haunted me ever since, challenging everything I thought I knew about consciousness and reality. The surgery itself was routine, but what I experienced was anything but. My first awareness came in complete darkness. Not the darkness of a moonless night or a windowless room, but an absolute void that seemed to have substance and weight. I could hear voices around me, medical staff discussing my condition, family members praying for my recovery. But their voices grew increasingly distant, as if I was moving away from them, or perhaps they from me. Then came the light. This wasn't the harsh fluorescence of hospital lighting, or the warm glow of sunlight. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered, brilliant, yet not blinding, intense, yet somehow gentle. The light seemed to have consciousness, purpose, and as it drew closer, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Then I heard my mother's voice, not from the operating room, but from somewhere within the light itself. She was speaking about me, describing me as a small child, talking about my first tears. I could feel myself crying, though I had no physical form in this space. The light was now so close I could have reached out and touched it, if I'd had hands to reach with. It carried a presence, an intelligence that felt ancient and infinite. I sensed that stepping into that light would answer every question I'd ever had, solve every mystery that had ever puzzled me. Just as I prepared to embrace the light, I felt myself being pulled back. The sensation wasn't violent or uncomfortable, but it was absolutely inexorable. I emerged from the experience to find myself in the recovery room, surrounded by medical equipment and concerned faces. The hospital staff attributed my experience to the effects of anesthesia, but it felt far too real. too significant to be dismissed as a drug-induced hallucination. The memory remains crystal clear years later, unlike the hazy recollections typically associated with anesthetic dreams. I'm not a particularly religious person, and I approach supernatural claims with healthy skepticism. But that experience changed me fundamentally. The light I encountered felt more real than anything I've experienced before or since, and the peace it offered still calls to me in quiet moments. What was that light? Was it the threshold between life and death, or something even more profound? I don't claim to have answers, but I know with absolute certainty that what I experienced was real, whatever its true nature might have been. To this day, I sometimes catch glimpses of that same quality of light in everyday moments, in the golden hour just before sunset, or in the first rays of dawn breaking through morning mist. Each time, it brings back that profound sense of peace and understanding, reminding me that there are aspects of existence that defy our limited human comprehension. I never imagined my first job at a retail store would lead to a nightmare of stalking and obsession. Working overnight shifts as a stock person wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills while I attended university. Our staff changed frequently, mostly students and temporary workers, which meant we rarely formed close friendships outside of work hours. Enter Daniel. He started a few months after me, initially seeming perfectly normal, agreeable, talkative, and good at his job. He mentioned being on the autism spectrum, which perhaps made me more tolerant of some early warning signs I should have heeded. At first, he would just hang around another coworker and me during breaks. We became casual friends, sometimes spending break time together. He seemed lonely, and having no other friends at work, gravitated toward our small group. I was in a difficult place mentally at the time, and having someone validate my feelings felt comforting. The first red flag appeared when he started becoming physically inappropriate. During conversations, he would initiate unwanted back rubs. I was uncomfortable, but initially said nothing, not wanting to seem rude. When I finally spoke up and asked him to stop, he appeared apologetic until he did it again. Each time we were alone, his behavior grew more predatory. The look in his eyes changed from friendly to something darker, more obsessive. He began confessing disturbing things from his past, including an incident with a former friend that made my blood run cold. Though he expressed remorse, something about his demeanor felt calculated, as if he was testing my reactions. The situation escalated when he began appearing at odd times during my shifts, watching me work. He would try to engage me in conversation about my relationship with my boyfriend, often making subtle attempts to undermine our connection. When I began distancing myself, he grew increasingly persistent. After I finally cut contact, his behavior became truly frightening. He would arrive early every night to set out my work supplies, leave me food and water, and wait in the parking lot to follow me home. He would park near my house and wait, sometimes for half an hour, just watching. He memorized my routine and would time his movements to coincide with mine. Months of ignoring him did nothing to deter his obsession. He continued leaving notes, writing my initials on work cards, and maintaining a constant, oppressive presence. Even after managers spoke with him, He persisted in his behavior, though more subtly. He would look sad or angry when passing me, playing the victim while continuing his stalking. The situation reached a breaking point when I discovered he had drawn smiley faces on every window of my car. Human resources finally became involved, but their response was frustratingly slow. He still leaves work carts out for me and rewrites my initials on them, acting as if his helpfulness justifies his obsessive behavior. My experience illustrates how stalking often begins with seemingly innocent interactions. The perpetrator may present themselves as friendly, lonely, or misunderstood, gradually pushing boundaries while maintaining plausible deniability. By the time their true nature becomes clear, they've already established patterns of behavior that are difficult to address through official channels. What makes this situation particularly unsettling is how he maintains this facade of helpfulness while clearly demonstrating obsessive behavior. His actions send a clear message. I'm watching you. I know your schedule. I have access to your personal space. It's a form of psychological terrorism masked as friendship and concern. This experience has fundamentally changed how I interact with coworkers. I've learned that maintaining professional boundaries isn't rude. It's essential for safety. Most importantly, I've learned to trust my instincts when someone's behavior feels wrong, even if I can't immediately articulate why. The situation continues to evolve, with HR moving at a glacial pace, while he finds new, subtle ways to maintain his presence in my life. Each day brings a new reminder that someone is watching, waiting, and refusing to respect basic boundaries. It's a unique kind of psychological torture, knowing that someone who presents such a helpful, harmless facade harbors such disturbing, obsessive tendencies. The rental listing seemed too good to be true. A master bedroom with private bathroom in a beachfront property in San Diego, priced well below market value. My friend Lucia was searching for a place near her new job, and this seemed perfect at first glance. Being cautious, she went to view the property on her bike. The house itself was charming. A classic California beach cottage with weather-worn shingles and a wraparound porch. The neighborhood was bustling with tourists and locals, creating what should have been a safe, welcoming environment. The moment things turned strange was when she met the current tenants. Two men occupied the smaller bedrooms. A disheveled younger man in his 20s who appeared perpetually dazed, and an older man around 50 who spoke with unsettling intensity while maintaining uncomfortably long eye contact. Throughout the showing, the older man stood unnecessarily close to Lucia, his gaze never leaving her as he explained the rental terms. The younger man simply followed them around, saying nothing, but staring with an unsettling blank expression. The master bedroom itself was impressive, featuring a massive four-poster bed that seemed out of place in the beach house setting. The bathroom was equally unusual, with multiple shower heads arranged in a pattern that suggested it was designed for group use. Red flags began appearing in rapid succession. The older man explained that the bed was bolted to the floor and couldn't be moved. It came with special sheets that must be used, and there were strict rules about guests. Only young women were allowed to visit, and they had to sleep in the bed, not on the floor or furniture. He went on to describe mandatory social events, including an annual ski trip to Lake Tahoe. The trip was free for her and any female friends she might invite, but attendance was required. There would be other men there, he explained, each bringing their own female companions. The way he described these arrangements sent chills down Lucia's spine. His choice of words, his intense stare, the younger man's vacant expression. Everything suggested something far more sinister than a simple rental agreement. Our minds immediately went to dark places. Was this an elaborate setup for exploitation? A front for trafficking? The bedroom's unusual features, the specific rules about female guests, the mandatory trip with strange men. It all painted a disturbing picture. Needless to say, Lucia never contacted them again. But the experience raised troubling questions. How many other young women had viewed that room? Had anyone actually moved in? What happened on those ski trips? The possibilities were too disturbing to contemplate. The incident served as a stark reminder that danger often hides behind seemingly legitimate facades. A rental listing, a beach house, a ski trip, all normal things that in this context took on a sinister dimension. It highlighted how predators can use ordinary situations to create opportunities for exploitation. Sometimes the best evidence of danger isn't what you see, but what you feel. Every instinct Lucia had screamed that something was wrong, even before the red flags became obvious. That intuition, that gut feeling that something isn't right, often proves to be our best defense against those who would do us harm. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.